The sky, a bruised canvas of deep violet and molten gold, stretched endlessly over the quiet countryside. The last remnants of daylight clung to the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows through the dense forest that lined the narrow dirt road. A cool breeze whistled through the trees, rattling the dry leaves and carrying the faint scent of damp earth and pine. Sam, Mia, Josh, and Riley walked together, their voices breaking the stillness of the evening. They had taken this path countless times before. It was their shortcut home, a well-worn trail cutting through the woods. Tonight, however, something about the journey felt different. The air was heavier, almost electric, as if the trees were holding their breath. Josh sighed loudly, dragging his sneakers through the loose dirt. "This shortcut's a joke," he grumbled. "Your secret way is just more walking, Sam." Sam smirked, unfazed. "Trust me, it's faster." Mia crossed her arms, unimpressed. "You said that half an hour ago." Riley, who had been trailing slightly behind the group, barely heard them. His gaze was fixed on the tree-line, where the darkness thickened unnaturally. The trees swayed gently, yet the rustling leaves carried no real sound. An unsettling quiet had settled over the woods, as if something unseen lurked just beyond their sight. Then he saw it. Tunnel. It stood a short distance away, nestled within the undergrowth as though it had been waiting to be discovered. The entrance was wide, almost perfectly circular, framed by thick stone that looked ancient, weathered and cracked by time. Vines crawled up its sides like veins, and the mouth of the tunnel gaped open, swallowing the dim light of dusk. Riley stopped in his tracks. "Guys!" The others turned, following his gaze. Mia's brow furrowed. "That wasn't here before." Josh scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Of course it was. We just never noticed." Sam took a slow step forward, his head tilting in curiosity. "It's weird, though. No signs, no markings, just a tunnel in the middle of nowhere." Riley's stomach twisted. "It feels wrong." Josh grinned, his usual bravado kicking in. "Only one way to find out." Stepping inside was like entering another world. The first thing Riley noticed was the air thick, stagnant, clinging to his skin like a damp shroud. It smelled of old earth and something faintly metallic, a scent that sent an uneasy shiver down his spine. Their footsteps echoed eerily against the stone floor, the sound stretching unnaturally down the passage. The tunnel's walls were rough, made of uneven bricks that jutted out at odd angles, like bones pressing through thin skin. The deeper they moved, the more the darkness thickened, swallowing the edges of their vision. Josh flicked on his flashlight, and the narrow beam cut through the void. The tunnel extended far beyond what should have been possible, an impossibly long corridor stretching endlessly ahead. No curves, no breaks, just darkness. "This is awesome," Sam whispered, his voice barely above a breath. Mia shivered, rubbing her arms. "It's colder here." Riley hesitated before reaching out to touch the wall. It was dry, too dry for a place that felt so damp. He swallowed hard. Something's not right. Josh, oblivious to the growing tension, walked ahead with an easy confidence. He whistled, the sound bouncing around them before twisting into something unnatural. Distorted, stretched, warped. Mia flinched. "Let's not go too far." Josh smirked. Scared. Mia scowled but didn't answer. Then, a whisper. Soft, almost a sigh. They all froze. Riley's breath caught in his throat. "Did you hear that?" No one answered. Josh lifted his flashlight, sweeping the beam ahead. The tunnel remained the same, endless, empty, wrong. The silence pressed against them, heavier now. Mia grabbed Sam's sleeve. "We should go back." Josh chuckled, but there was a nervous edge to it. "Come on, it's just a tunnel. Probably just the wind." Riley wasn't convinced. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. Then, something moved. At the very edge of the flashlight's reach, just beyond the visible light, stood a figure. Still, watching. For a moment, none of them moved. The figure stood motionless, a silhouette barely distinguishable from the darkness itself. It had no features, no details, just a vague, human-like outline that seemed to pulse with the shifting shadows. Riley tried to speak, but his voice stuck in his throat. The flashlight flickered. The figure was gone. "Did you see that?" Riley rasped, his skin crawling. Mia clutched his arm, her grip ice-cold. "See what?" Josh swung the flashlight wildly. "Dude, there's nothing there." But Riley knew what he had seen. A gust of air brushed past them, carrying a stronger wave of that strange, metallic scent. The tunnel suddenly felt too small, as if the walls were pressing inward. Mia took a shaky step back. "We're leaving." Sam nodded. "Yeah, let's go." Josh sighed but didn't argue. "Fine, whatever." They turned and stopped. The exit was gone. The tunnel stretched behind them, just as endlessly as it had ahead. Mia's breathing turned shallow. No, we didn't walk that far." Josh tightened his jaw. "We must have taken a turn." Riley shook his head. "There weren't any turns." Silence. Then, a whisper. "Close. Too close." Mia spun around, eyes wide. "Who said that?" Nobody answered. Josh's knuckles whitened around the flashlight. "We keep moving. One direction." They walked faster, their footsteps an unnatural echo in the too quiet space. Riley's skin prickled with every step. The air thickened, pressing against them like unseen hands. Then, Josh stopped. "What is it?" Mia whispered. Josh lifted his flashlight. Another tunnel had appeared, branching off to the right. Riley's stomach twisted. "That wasn't there before." Mia grabbed his sleeve. "I don't like this." Neither did he. Josh, however, grinned. "We gotta check it out." Riley grabbed his arm. "No, we don't." Josh yanked free. "Come on." What's the worst that could happen? The tunnel waited. Black, silent, and breathing. Something in the darkness shifted. Mia took a step back. "We go back. Now." Josh turned toward her, rolling his eyes. Then the light flickered, and the walls moved. Not a trick of the eyes. Not an illusion. The bricks rippled like water. The tunnel exhaled. Then the lights went out. Mia screamed. Riley grabbed blindly, but there was nothing. Only space where his friends had been. A rush of cold air swept through him, stealing the breath from his lungs. The darkness was alive, curling around him like fingers. A whisper in his ear. Low, amused. "Run." He did, or at least he thought he did. Because when the light returned, Josh was gone. The second tunnel was narrower, colder. Their footsteps barely echoed now, swallowed by the thick silence pressing in on all sides. The walls were damp, and the air had a strange metallic scent, like rust or blood. Mia's hand trembled in Riley's. "Josh, slow down." Josh didn't. He was ahead now, his flashlight bouncing off the slick stone walls. His steps were eager, careless. The deeper they went, the heavier the air became, pressing down on their chests like an unseen weight. Then, a sound. Faint. A slow, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. Josh stopped. The flashlight flickered again. Then I went out. Darkness swallowed them whole. Mia gasped. Riley fumbled for his phone, his fingers shaking. "Josh!" Silence. Then a single sound. A footstep. Not theirs. Sam cursed under his breath. "Turn the light back on." Josh's voice came, shaky now. I'm trying." His breaths were shallow, uneven. Then, a breath. Right behind them. Soft. Slow. Mia screamed. Light flared back on. Josh was alone. Sam's voice cracked. "Where's Riley?" The tunnel was empty. No Riley. No footsteps. Just silence. Mia's breathing came fast, ragged. "He was right here." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it echoed down the passage, stretching unnaturally into the darkness. Josh swallowed hard. Maybe he ran back? Mia shook her head violently. Riley wouldn't just. Then something new. A door. Old. Wooden. Standing in the wall where there had been nothing before. The wood was cracked and warped with age, its surface covered in deep scratches, as if something had tried to claw its way in. Or out. Josh raised his flashlight. Scratched into the surface, barely visible, were words. "Do not open." Mia's voice trembled. "We have to." Josh hesitated, his fingers tightening around the flashlight. Sam shook his head. "This is a bad idea." But Mia was already stepping forward. Slowly, she reached for the handle. The brass knob was ice-cold under her fingers. She turned it. The door creaked open. Beyond it, darkness, deep, endless. A black void that seemed to pull at them, swallowing the dim glow of their flashlight. And then, a figure, tall, still, watching, Riley. Except, his eyes were wrong. Wide, unblinking, too dark. They didn't reflect the light. They absorbed it. Mia's breath caught. She stepped back, her pulse hammering in her ears. "That's not him." Riley smiled. Not with his lips. With his teeth. Too many teeth. The door slammed shut. Riley was gone. Mia choked on a sob. Josh stumbled back, dragging Sam with him. The tunnel trembled. The air vibrated, an unnatural hum filling the space. Then, everything went black. Sunlight. Warm. Soft. Mia gasped, her eyes flying open. She was lying on her back, staring up at the sky. The trees swayed overhead, their leaves rustling in the breeze. The dirt road stretched behind them, untouched. Josh groaned, rubbing his head. What the hell just happened? His voice was thick with confusion. Sam sat up beside him, eyes wild. "Where's Riley?" They turned. The tunnel was gone. No entrance. No stone archway. Just trees and silence. Mia's hands shook. "No. No, no, no." She scrambled to her feet, spinning in circles, searching, calling his name. Nothing. Josh paled. He was right there. He. Sam grabbed his arm, his voice urgent. "We need to go." Mia's breath came in shudders. "We can't just leave." Josh's voice was hollow. "We already did." The wind shifted. A whisper. Soft. Familiar. Riley's voice. "I never left." The old estate sail had an eerie feel, as if the air itself carried whispers of the past. Dust swirled, lazily in the dim afternoon light, settling over forgotten furniture, yellowed books, and rusted trinkets. The scent of age lingered, old wood, faded paper, and something deeper, something like damp earth after a storm. People moved through the cluttered rooms in hushed voices, their fingers brushing over the remnants of a life once lived. A cracked porcelain doll lay abandoned on a wooden chair, its glassy eyes staring at nothing. A grandfather clock, its hands frozen at an unknown hour, stood against the far wall, its silence unsettling. Suri wasn't looking for anything in particular. She had just moved into a new apartment, and it felt empty. The space was modern, all clean lines and blank walls, but it lacked something. Something with character, with a past. She had come here hoping to find a piece that would make the apartment feel more like home. As she wandered through the sale, her gaze skimming over faded paintings and tarnished silverware, something caught her eye. A mirror. It stood alone against the back wall, partially hidden behind an old wooden wardrobe, as if someone had tried to push it out of sight. Suri stepped closer. The mirror was tall, nearly as tall as she was, with a thick wooden frame covered in strange, twisting carvings. The patterns looked like vines curling and wrapping around the edges, but as she examined them, they seemed almost alive, shifting ever so slightly in the dim light. The glass itself was oddly perfect. Not a single scratch, no dust, no smudges. It looked as though someone had just polished it, yet the air around it smelled old, like damp wood and faded perfume. Suri reached out and ran her fingers along the carved wood. Ice cold. A shiver ran up her arm. She pulled her hand back, flexing her fingers. It was just a mirror. An old one, yes, but nothing more than that. "How much for this?" she asked, turning to the old woman sitting behind the cash table. The woman, who had been counting change, looked up. Her face, lined with deep wrinkles, tensed the moment her gaze fell upon the mirror. Her fingers tightened around the bills in her hand, as if the sight of it had unsettled her. That mirror! She hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. Suri waited. 50, the woman finally said. Suri blinked. 50? That's it. Something this beautiful had to be worth more. Even in its old-fashioned design, it had a timeless elegance. The craftsmanship alone should have made it expensive. The woman nodded, her expression unreadable. Take it, she said quickly. Something in her voice made Suri pause. It wasn't just urgency, it was something else. Warning. A prickle of unease crawled up Suri's spine, but she shook it off. The woman was probably just eager to get rid of old junk. She handed over the cash, lifted the mirror carefully, and carried it to her car. The frame was heavy, much heavier than it looked, but she managed to maneuver it into the back seat. As she reached the driver's seat, a strange sensation washed over her, like someone was watching. Her skin prickled. She glanced around. The parking lot was mostly empty. A few cars, an old lamppost flickering in the afternoon light, a single bird pecking at the pavement. But then, in the mirror's reflection, behind her, a shadow moved, a flicker quick and unnatural. She spun around. Nothing was there. Her chest felt tight, probably just her imagination. She had read too many horror stories, watched too many late-night movies. With a deep breath, she climbed into the car and started the engine. She didn't notice the old woman still watching her from the porch, her lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers curling into the fabric of her skirt. And she didn't hear the whisper that slipped past the woman's lips. Poor girl. Suri carried the mirror into her apartment, her arms aching from the effort. The weight of it was surprising. It felt heavier now than it had at the sale, as if it had absorbed something along the way. She set it against the far wall in the living room, where the sunlight from the window hit it perfectly. The glass caught the light in an almost unnatural way, as if it were drinking it in rather than reflecting it. She stepped back, tilting her head. It looked perfect, too perfect. She ran her fingers over the carvings again, tracing the delicate lines of the twisting patterns. The wood was still ice-cold. Shaking off the unease, she turned away and grabbed her phone. She snapped a quick picture, thinking it would look great on social media. Estate sale find, my new favorite thing. But when she checked the photo, a strange feeling crept up her spine. The mirror looked normal, but the reflection of the room inside it seemed darker. The light in the picture didn't match what she saw in real life. She frowned. Maybe just a trick of the camera. Shrugging it off, she put her phone away and went to make dinner. That night, the apartment was quiet. Too quiet. She lay in bed, tossing and turning, unable to sleep. The silence pressed against her ears, heavy and unnatural. Usually, she could hear distant city sounds. Cars passing, people talking, the occasional siren, but tonight, there was nothing. As if the whole world had gone still. At midnight, she finally gave up and got out of bed. Maybe some water would help. She padded barefoot through the apartment, the wooden floor cool against her skin. As she passed the living room, her gaze flickered to the mirror. Something made her stop. She turned, staring at it in the darkness. The reflection showed the living room, her couch, her coffee table, the window with the curtains drawn shut. Then, a flicker, a movement, like something shifting deep within the glass. Her breath caught. She leaned in closer, her heart hammering against her ribs. Nothing, just her own reflection staring back at her. Suri let out a nervous laugh, shaking her head. Losing it, she muttered to herself. She turned away, but as she took a step, a cold wave of fear rushed through her. Her skin prickled. Her mouth went dry. She didn't want to look back, didn't want to check, but some deep, horrible instinct made her. Slowly, she turned her head. Her reflection hadn't moved. It was still standing there, staring. Suri's stomach dropped. For a long, breathless moment, neither of them moved. Then, her reflection smiled. A slow, unnatural smile that stretched too wide. A chill crawled down Suri's spine. She stepped back. The reflection didn't. And then it raised its hand and knocked against the glass. A dull, hollow knock echoed through the room. Suri stumbled backward, her breath coming in short gasps. No, no, no. The reflection took a step closer. But Suri hadn't moved. She turned and ran, her heart slamming against her ribs. Behind her, the mirror stood silent. And in its glass, the reflection of Suri kept watching, smiling. Over the next few days, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Sometimes, while reading or watching TV, she would catch movement in the corner of her eye, a flicker in the mirror, a shift. But whenever she looked directly at it, the reflection was still. Then came the whispers, soft, faint, almost like the wind. But there was no wind inside her apartment. One night, she woke up gasping, her heart racing. She had dreamt of standing in front of the mirror, unable to move, as something inside knocked against the glass from the other side. She shook off the dream, rubbing her arms against the cold that seemed to settle into her bones. She needed to get rid of the mirror. Tomorrow. The next night, everything changed. She was brushing her teeth when she heard it. A soft creak, like someone stepping on the wooden floor. Her breath hitched. Slowly, she turned off the tap and listened. Silence. She stepped out of the bathroom, moving toward the living room. The mirror stood there, silent, reflecting the darkened apartment. But the reflection was wrong. The furniture was there. The walls, the windows, everything was in place. But the Suri in the mirror was smiling, a slow, unnatural smile that stretched too wide. Suri's heart slammed against her ribs. Her reflection raised a hand and knocked against the glass. A dull, hollow knock echoed through the room. Suri stumbled back, her breath coming in short gasps. No, no, no. The reflection stepped closer. But Suri hadn't moved, placed its hand against the glass, and started pushing. The surface of the mirror rippled like water. The reflection's fingers pressed through. Suri turned and ran. She didn't stop running until she was outside, breathless, heart pounding. The night air was freezing, but she barely felt it. She pulled out her phone and dialed her best friend, Aisha. Aisha, I need you to come over, she said, her voice shaking. What's wrong? The mirror, she whispered. Something's wrong with it. Silence. Then Aisha sighed. Suri, it's just a mirror. Please, Suri begged. Aisha groaned. Fine. I'll be there in 10. Suri hung up, staring up at her apartment window. Something moved behind the glass. But it wasn't her. Aisha arrived, annoyed but concerned. Okay, what's the problem? Suri led her inside. The mirror stood exactly where it had been, still and silent. Aisha crossed her arms. Looks normal to me. Suri shook her head. Watch. She picked up a book and threw it at the mirror. It didn't reflect the impact. The book disappeared into the glass. Aisha's face lost all color. Then, the book flew back out, landing on the floor. But the reflection of the book, staying inside the mirror. Suri and Aisha started, frozen in fear. Then the reflection of Suri turned and spoke. You shouldn't have bought me. They ran. They didn't stop until they were outside, gasping for air. We have to destroy it, Aisha said. Suri nodded. Fire. Aisha shook her head. No, mirrors don't burn. Suri thought for a moment. A hammer. They grabbed a hammer from the toolbox and marched back inside. The reflection was waiting. It grinned, stepping closer. Suri raised the hammer. The reflection whispered, You break me. You take my place. Suri hesitated. Aisha grabbed the hammer. Screw this. She swung. The mirror shattered. For a moment, silence. Then, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the room. A gust of wind blew past them. The lights flickered, and the mirror was gone. Only an empty wall remained. Aisha and Suri stared at each other, their hearts still racing. Is it over? Aisha whispered. Suri didn't answer, because in the corner of the room, the glass shards on the floor still reflected the mirror. And in them, a pair of dark eyes watched. smiling. Ava never believed in bad luck, curses, or ghost stories. She lived in the real world, where everything had a logical explanation. Superstition was for people who needed something to blame when life didn't go their way. But today something felt off. She sat in her usual coffee shop, nestled in the corner by the window, where she could watch the busy street outside. The scent of freshly ground coffee beans and warm pastries filled the air, mixing with the quiet hum of conversations and the occasional clink of spoons against ceramic mugs. Her laptop sat open in front of her, emails waiting to be finished, but she had barely typed a sentence in the last 15 minutes. Someone was distracting her. Across the street, a man stood perfectly still. He wasn't checking his phone, wasn't smoking a cigarette, wasn't even looking around as if waiting for someone. He was just standing, watching. Ava's stomach tightened. He was dressed in a long, dark coat, his hands buried deep in his pockets. A street lamp cast a faint glow over the sidewalk, but his face remained shadowed, obscured just enough that she couldn't make out his features. Still, she could feel his gaze, locked onto her. A shiver crawled up her spine. She tore her eyes away, shaking off the unease. It was a city, people lingered all the time. Maybe he was waiting for a friend, or maybe he was just lost in thought. She was being paranoid. But the longer she sat there, the more uneasy she became. Minutes passed. She forced herself to focus on her laptop, tapping her fingers against the keyboard. But the words blurred together. The pull to glance out the window gnawed at her, an itch she couldn't ignore. Slowly, she looked up. Her breath caught. He was still there, standing in the exact same position. Ava swallowed hard. Okay, that was weird. Her fingers tightened around her coffee cup. He hadn't moved an inch in over 20 minutes. That wasn't normal, was it? Her hands felt clammy as she reached for her phone. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe she just needed a second opinion. She lifted the camera, making sure to keep it subtle, and snapped a picture through the window. She sent it to Emma with a quick message. Tell me I'm not crazy. This guy has been standing outside for 20 minutes, just staring. The reply came almost instantly. What guy? Ava frowned. She quickly typed back. The one in the coat, right across the street. 3 dots appeared, then vanished. Then, Ava, there's no one there. Her breath hitched. Her fingers trembled as she looked at the picture she had just taken. The sidewalk, the street lamp, the passing cars. No man. Heart pounding, she snapped her gaze up to the window again. The man was gone. Ava's stomach twisted into knots. She glanced around the cafe, searching for someone who might have noticed him. Someone who could confirm that she hadn't imagined it. But everyone was just carrying on as normal, oblivious. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down. Maybe Emma had just looked too quickly. Maybe the man had walked away right before she checked. Or maybe she was seeing something that wasn't there. The rest of the day felt like a blur. Ava tried to push the whole thing out of her mind, convincing herself that it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But deep down, a sick feeling lingered. At lunchtime, she met Emma at their usual cafe, a cozy little place with wooden tables and mismatched chairs, filled with the warm scent of vanilla and cinnamon. They grabbed a spot by the window, sunlight casting long shadows across the sidewalk outside. Emma was already sipping on an iced latte, stirring the straw absent-mindedly. She looked up as Ava sat down. Okay, tell me what's going on. You've been weird all morning. Ava hesitated, drumming her fingers against the table. I swear I saw someone outside the coffee shop earlier. He was just standing there, staring. I took a picture and sent it to you, but you said there was no one there. Emma tilted her head, eyebrows knitting together. Yeah, because there wasn't. Ava exhaled, shifting in her seat. But I saw him, Emma. I know I did. And then when I checked again, he was gone. Emma took another sip of her drink, considering. Could have just been a random guy and you caught him right as he left. Ava shook her head. He was there for at least 20 minutes. He never moved. And when I looked at the picture, he wasn't in it. Emma's expression shifted, a flicker of concern in her eyes. Okay. That is weird. She leaned forward. You sure you're not just stressed? You've been working a lot lately. Ava let out a nervous laugh. I thought that too. Maybe I'm just overthinking it. But she wasn't sure. Something deep in her gut told her this wasn't just a trick of the mind. Then, without thinking, she glanced outside, and her heart stopped. He was there, standing on the opposite sidewalk. Same coat, same posture, still watching. Ava's breath came short and fast. She reached across the table, gripping Emma's wrist. Look, do you see him now? Emma followed her gaze, her brow furrowing. See who? Ava's stomach dropped. She turned back to the window. The man was right there. How could Emma not see him? Her throat went dry. You seriously don't see anyone standing by that streetlight? Emma's face twisted in confusion. She looked again, even leaned forward slightly. Then she shook her head. Ava, there's no one there. Ava's hands felt cold, her fingers numb. This was wrong. This was so wrong. She turned back to Emma, then slowly back to the window. The man was gone. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She pressed a hand to her forehead. Maybe I really am just tired. Emma smiled gently, though the concern hadn't left her eyes. See? Nothing to worry about. Ava forced a nod, even as every nerve in her body screamed that something was very, very wrong. By the time the sun began to set, the fear had only gotten worse. And somewhere deep inside her, she knew this wasn't over. Ava walked home with quick, deliberate steps, her pulse hammering in her ears. The city around her was slowing down for the night, cars passing lazily, their headlights washing over empty sidewalks. A few distant voices drifted from a bar nearby, laughter cutting through the cold evening air. But for Ava, everything felt muted, distant, as if she were moving through water. She told herself, again, that she was being ridiculous, that she had imagined the whole thing, that exhaustion was playing tricks on her mind. But deep down, she didn't believe it. Her apartment building came into view, a familiar structure of brick and glass. Normally seeing, it brought relief, safety. Tonight, it only made the tightness in her chest worse. She hurried inside, the glass doors sliding shut behind her. The lobby was mostly empty, except for the night guard, a burly man named Tom, who always greeted her with a nod. Tonight was no different. Evening, Miss Ava, he said, eyes barely lifting from his crossword puzzle. She forced a smile. Evening. Ava walked toward the elevator, pressing the button with a shaky finger. The soft ding of arrival made her exhale in relief. She stepped inside, the warm glow of the overhead lights comforting. In its familiarity, the doors slid shut. She let out a breath, closing her eyes for a moment, trying to shake the unease from her body. Then, a hand caught the door just before it shut. Ava's heart stopped. The metal doors slid open again, and before she could react, before she could even move, he stepped in. The man in the dark coat. Ava's breath caught in her throat. Every hair on her body stood on end. He didn't say a word. He didn't even look at her. He stood at the far end of the elevator, near the corner, his posture unnaturally stiff. The dim lighting barely touched his face, keeping his features hidden in shadow. Ava's entire body screamed at her to run, to do something, but she couldn't move. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, nails digging into her palms. She wanted to reach out to press the emergency button, but her arms felt like they were made of lead. The elevator doors slid shut. The small space suddenly felt suffocating. The only sound was the soft hum of the elevator as it ascended. Ava swallowed hard. Her throat felt dry. Then, the man turned his head slightly. Not fully. Not enough for her to see his whole face. just enough to let her know that he was aware of her, that he knew she was there. The air thickened, pressing down on her like an unseen weight. The elevator dinged. The doors slid open. He stepped out. Ava let out a shaky breath, relief flooding her chest. Then he did something that made her stomach drop. He smiled. The sight of it sent an icy wave through her body. His mouth stretched too wide, the corners pulling unnaturally far. His teeth, too many, too sharp, gleamed under the dim hallway lights. Ava felt like the floor had vanished beneath her. She was frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe, as he disappeared down the hallway. The doors shut again, sealing her inside the metal box. Ava slammed the button for her floor, heart hammering against her ribs. Her hands trembled violently as she squeezed her eyes shut. This isn't real. This isn't real. The elevator dinged again. Her floor. She stumbled out, fumbling for her keys with shaking fingers. The hallway stretched in front of her, long and empty. Every step felt too loud, echoing in the silence. Finally, she reached her apartment. She shoved the key into the lock, twisting it with more force than necessary. The door swung open, and she practically threw herself inside, slamming it shut behind her. She locked the deadbolt, then the chain. Then she pressed her back against the wood, her chest rising and falling in quick, uneven breaths. Silence. She was alone, but she couldn't shake the feeling. He wasn't gone. Somewhere he was waiting, watching, and the next time she saw him, she might not be able to look away. Ava barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, standing there, staring, his face just out of reach. That awful, too wide smile burned into her mind. At some point, exhaustion overtook her, but it was a restless, dream-ridden sleep. She woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. A message from Emma. "Hey, you okay? You were acting weird yesterday." Ava hesitated before typing back. "Yeah, just tired. Let's meet for coffee later." She needed to tell someone. She couldn't keep this to herself. By the time she arrived at the cafe, the sun was high in the sky, casting sharp shadows along the sidewalk. The sight of normal people, walking their dogs, chatting on their phones, sipping lattes, almost made her feel ridiculous for how terrified she'd been. Almost. Emma was already at a table, sipping her drink. She looked up and frowned. "Wow, you look like you've seen a ghost." Ava forced a laugh. "That's not far from the truth." Emma set her cup down. "Okay, spill." Ava hesitated, then leaned in, lowering her voice. "The man I told you about. I saw him again. Last night." Emma's expression shifted. "You mean the one you thought you saw?" "No," Ava said, voice tight. "I saw him. In the elevator. He got in with me." Emma's eyes widened. "What? Did he say anything?" Ava shook her head. "No. But he turned to me and he smiled." "Emma, it wasn't a normal smile. It was..." She shivered, rubbing her arms. "Wrong. His mouth was too wide. His teeth." She stopped, swallowing hard. Emma's concern deepened. "Ava, are you sure this isn't just your mind playing tricks on you? Maybe you're stressed or sleep-deprived." "I know what I saw," Ava snapped, a little too harshly. Emma held up her hands. Okay. What do you want to do?" Ava exhaled, rubbing her temples. "I don't know, but I have a feeling this isn't over." Emma reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "We'll figure it out. You're not alone." Ava nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Because as she looked out the cafe window, there he was, standing across the street, watching. Ava's blood ran cold. She turned to Emma, barely able to get the words out. "Tell me you see him." Emma followed her gaze, then frowned. "Ava, there's no one there." Ava felt the world tilt beneath her. She turned back. The man was gone. Ava clutched the table to keep from swaying. Her pulse thundered in her ears. And deep inside she knew, this wasn't just a stalker. It wasn't even human. And whatever it wasn't done with her yet. Noah was 6 years old when he first saw the shadow under his bed. It was late at night, and the warm glow of his nightlight cast a dim circle of light onto the floor, but it wasn't enough to push back the heavy darkness pooling beneath the wooden frame. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, his small hands clutching the blanket to his chin, as if the fabric alone could protect him from the creeping unease building in his chest. The house was silent. His parents had gone to bed an hour ago, and even the distant hum of the refrigerator had stopped. The only sound was the soft ticking of the clock on his wall. But Noah could hear something else. A faint whispering, barely more than a breath, coming from under his bed. At first he thought it was the wind. He turned his head toward the window, but the curtains remained still. There was no draft, no rustling of leaves outside. The windows were shut tight, sealed against the cold autumn night. He held his breath, straining his ears. The sound was so soft, like a voice just on the edge of hearing, murmuring words he couldn't quite understand. Curiosity, mixed with fear, gripped his small body. His fingers clutched the blanket tighter, but he found himself shifting closer to the edge of the mattress. Slowly, hesitantly, he leaned over and peered into the darkness below. A pair of eyes stared back at him. Noah's breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. The eyes weren't like his own, weren't like anything he had ever seen before. They weren't white. They weren't blue or brown or green. They were black, darker than the shadows around them, yet somehow still gleaming. Then they blinked. Noah gasped, jerking upright. His tiny hands clutched at the blanket as he scrambled backward, pressing himself against the headboard. His breathing was quick and shallow, and for a moment he thought about calling for his parents. But what if they didn't believe him? He squeezed his eyes shut and yanked the blanket over his head, curling into a ball. His fingers trembled as he pressed them against his ears, trying to block out everything. But the whispering didn't stop. It was there, slithering through the silence, filling the room like a soft breeze carrying the echoes of 100 voices. It didn't grow louder, but it didn't fade either. Noah lay like that for what felt like hours, his small body shaking beneath the covers. Eventually, exhaustion won. His limbs grew heavy, and his racing heart slowed. His mind drifted toward sleep, but just before he surrendered to it, he heard something that made his skin crawl. A whisper right next to his ear. Noah! The morning light flooded Noah's room, turning the shadows into harmless shapes. The fear from the night before still clung to him like cobwebs, but in the safety of the day it almost felt silly. Almost. Noah wasted no time rushing into the kitchen, where his parents sat at the table. His mother was sipping her coffee, her dark curls still messy from sleep, while his father read the newspaper, occasionally taking a bite of his toast. Mom! Dad! Noah's voice was urgent, his tiny hands gripping the edge of the table. There's something under my bed. His mother lowered her cup, concern flashing in her warm brown eyes. What do you mean, sweetheart? I saw it last night. It had eyes, and it whispered to me. Noah's voice wavered, his small body tense with the weight of what he had seen. His father chuckled, shaking his head. It's just your imagination, buddy. Maybe a bad dream. No! Noah shook his head fiercely. It was real. I saw it move. His father sighed, folding the newspaper and setting it aside. Noah, you're old enough to know that monsters aren't real. Shadows are just tricks of the light. But, no buts, his father said firmly. You're letting your imagination run wild. Noah's mother gave him a gentler look. How about I check under your bed tonight? If there's nothing there, will you promise to sleep without worrying? Noah hesitated. He wanted to believe that if his mom looked, she'd see it too. That she'd believe him. Okay, he mumbled. That night, after tucking Noah in, his mother knelt beside his bed. The warm glow of the nightlight cast long shadows across the room, but she didn't seem scared. She lifted the blanket and peeked underneath. See? She turned to him with a smile. Nothing but dust bunnies. She ruffled his hair, pressing a kiss to his forehead. Now get some sleep, love. Noah wanted to believe her. He really did. But as soon as she left the room and closed the door, the whispering started again. And this time it called his name. Over the next few nights, things got worse. The whispering never stopped. It was there every night, just beyond his understanding, soft, raspy, filled with something wrong. Noah tried to ignore it. He buried his face in his pillow, squeezed his eyes shut, and counted sheep, but ignoring it didn't make it go away. The shadow didn't just whisper anymore. It moved. Noah would see it shifting in the darkness, growing longer, stretching toward him in slow, deliberate motions. The eyes would flicker open and shut, blinking at him like something alive. One night, he tried to be brave. He sat up in bed, gripping his blanket like a shield, and whispered, "Who are you?" The whispering stopped. The silence stretched. And then, it laughed. A dry, crackling sound, like dead leaves rustling in the wind, like something ancient, something that had been waiting a very, very long time. Noah screamed. His father burst into the room, flipping on the light. The brightness chased away the shadows, leaving nothing but the normal shapes of his toys and furniture. "Noah, what is it?" His father's face was a mixture of exhaustion and irritation. "The shadow," Noah cried. "It laughed at me." His father groaned, rubbing his temples. "Noah, enough. There's no such thing as a shadow that talks. You're letting your imagination get the best of you." "But," "No buts." His father's voice was firm. "If you keep this up, we'll have to take away your nightlight. You're too old for this nonsense." Tears burned in Noah's eyes. He wanted to stop being scared. He wanted to believe his dad. But the shadow wouldn't leave him alone. And worse, it was getting closer. By the end of the week, Noah stopped sleeping. His face grew pale and dark circles bloomed under his eyes. He refused to play with his toys and refused to eat much at dinner. His mother started to worry. "I think something is really bothering him," she whispered to her husband one evening. "Maybe he's getting sick." His father sighed. "Or maybe he's just looking for attention. You baby him too much." "I don't know. This is different. He looks scared all the time." That night, his mother stayed up later than usual. Just as she was about to go to bed, she heard something faint, almost like wind whistling through a crack in the window, except the windows were shut. Frowning, she walked down the hall and stopped outside Noah's door. She pressed her ear against it. Whispers. Low, raspy voices, more than one. Chills ran down her spine. She swung the door open. Noah was sitting up in bed, trembling. His wide eyes locked on the darkness under his bed. His lips were moving, but no sound came out. "Noah?" she called. He flinched and turned to her, his face pale as a ghost. "It's trying to come out," he whispered. Her stomach dropped. That night, Noah's mother refused to leave his room. She brought in a chair and sat beside his bed, determined to prove to him and to herself that there was nothing to be afraid of. Hours passed. The house was silent. Then, a slow, scraping sound came from under the bed. Noah's mother froze. Her breath hitched. Had she imagined it? She leaned forward, gripping the edge of Noah's blanket. The sound came again. A dragging, scratching noise, like nails running along wood. She swallowed hard. "Noah?" Tears welled up in his eyes. He shook his head violently. "Don't look," he whispered. "It doesn't like being seen." A chill ran down her spine. But she had to know. Slowly, her trembling hand reached for the blanket and lifted it. Her scream never left her throat. Two glowing eyes, set deep in a gaping, toothless mouth, stared back at her from the darkness. The shadow under the bed shifted, stretching toward her, reaching with long, claw-like fingers. She yanked the blanket back down, grabbing Noah and pulling him against her chest. The room went deathly silent. Then, A whisper slithered through the air. You shouldn't have looked. The next morning, Noah's mother packed their bags. We're leaving, she told her husband, her hands shaking as she shoved clothes into a suitcase. What? You're being ridiculous, he scoffed. No, I'm not, she snapped, spinning to face him. I saw it. Under his bed. It's real. The blood drained from his face. You what? I saw it, she repeated, her voice breaking. I don't care what you think. We are not staying here. But before they could leave, Noah screamed. They ran into his room. The bed was empty. The blankets were on the floor. The room was ice cold. And under the bed, a shadow writhed, stretching up the walls. Whispers filled the room. He belongs to us now. Noah's mother dropped to her knees, reaching under the bed, grabbing for him. But her hands met nothing but cold air. Noah was gone. The police never found him. His parents moved away, unable to bear the silence of an empty house. But his room remained untouched. And at night, when the house was dark and quiet, the whispering started again, waiting for someone new. Oliver had always been a rational man. He didn't believe in ghosts, demons, or any of those creepy urban legends people like to tell on cold, stormy nights. But the first time he heard the knock, he couldn't ignore the way it made his skin crawl. It was 3 a.m. when the sound echoed through his quiet house. A sharp, deliberate knock at the front door. 3 taps. Knock, knock, knock. Oliver stirred from his sleep, groggy and disoriented. At first he thought he had imagined it, just some lingering remnant of a dream. But as his mind cleared, he realized the sound had been real. It had been too crisp, too distinct to be a figment of his imagination. His heart thudded against his ribs as he sat up in bed. His bedroom was on the 2nd floor, and through his window he could see the empty street below, bathed in the cold glow of the streetlights. Nothing moved. No figures, no cars, not even the stray cat that sometimes prowled the neighborhood. The house was old, and the wooden floor creaked beneath his feet as he swung his legs over the side of the bed. A chill ran through him, though he wasn't sure if it was from the cold or something deeper, something instinctual. The hallway outside his room was dark, except for the dim glow of the nightlight in the bathroom. He hesitated at the top of the stairs, straining his ears. Silence. Had he imagined it? Shaking his head, Oliver slowly descended the stairs. His bare feet felt ice-cold against the hardwood floor as he approached the front door. His breath hitched as he peered through the peephole. Nothing. The street outside was eerily still. No movement. No sign of anyone standing there just seconds ago. He reached for the lock and hesitated. A voice in the back of his mind whispered, "Don't open it." But curiosity won. He twisted the deadbolt and cracked the door open just enough to peek outside. A gust of cold air rushed in, sending a shiver down his spine. The porch was empty. The front yard, the sidewalk. Everything was still untouched, as if no one had been there. Frowning, he shut the door and locked it again. Maybe he had been dreaming. Maybe it had been the wind or the house settling. Still, as he climbed back into bed and pulled the covers up to his chin, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling crawling beneath his skin. And then, just as his eyes began to close, a whisper, faint, almost too soft to hear, right outside the door. "Let me in." Oliver's eyes snapped open, his pulse hammering in his ears. He held his breath, listening. But there was only silence. The knocking came again the next night. And the night after that. Always at 3 a.m. Always 3 knocks. At first, Oliver tried to ignore it. He forced himself to stay in bed, squeezing his eyes shut, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks. But he couldn't. Each knock sent a pulse of fear through his chest. A deep, instinctual terror that made his skin prickle. Felt wrong. By the 4th night, he was ready. He sat in the living room directly across from the front door, staring at it as the clock on the wall ticked toward 3 a.m. 2:59. He held his breath. The clock struck 3. Knock, knock, knock. Oliver's heart slammed against his ribs. The sound was clear, precise. There was no mistaking. Something was standing outside his house. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. This time he wouldn't be afraid. This time, he would catch whoever was playing this twisted game with him. He grabbed the baseball bat he had brought downstairs earlier and rose to his feet, his pulse thundering in his ears as he approached the door. One deep breath. His hand tightened around the doorknob. And then he yanked it open. Nothing. The porch was empty. The street was deathly still. But something was different this time. As Oliver turned back toward the house, a wave of cold dread washed over him. There, on the wooden surface of the door, were 3 deep scratches. Long, jagged, claw-like marks. His stomach twisted. He hadn't heard anything scrape the door. No dragging. No scratching. Only the knocks. But the marks were there, fresh. Something had been standing there. Something had been watching. The next morning, Oliver called his best friend, Daniel. "There's someone messing with me," Oliver said, his fingers gripping the phone tightly. "Every night at 3 a.m. 3 knocks. No one's there. But now there are scratches on my door." Daniel, always the skeptic, chuckled. "Dude, it's probably just some kid playing a prank. For 5 nights in a row? Always at the exact same time." Oliver ran a hand through his hair. "This isn't normal." Daniel sighed. "Look, I'll come over tonight. We'll sit on your porch with a camera. When your little ghost knocks, we'll catch them in the act." Oliver wasn't convinced, but he didn't want to be alone when it happened again. Fine. That night, Daniel arrived just before midnight, armed with a camera, a flashlight, and a smug grin. "All right, let's bust this mystery." They set up on the porch, bundled in hoodies against the cold, waiting. 2:59 a.m. Daniel adjusted his camera. "All right, let's see this." The clock hit 3 a.m. Knock, knock, knock. Daniel froze. His face paled, and his grip on the camera tightened. Oliver swallowed hard, staring at the door. Daniel slowly turned the camera toward the street. And then the porch light flickered. The air changed. It became heavy, thick, like something unseen was pressing against them. The world felt tilted, wrong. Oliver took a deep breath and stood. His shaking hand reached for the doorknob. He threw the door open. Nothing. No wind. No footsteps. No sign of anyone. But then, Daniel let out a strangled gasp. He pointed a trembling finger at the ground. There, in the dirt just outside the door, were footprints. But they weren't human. They were long, narrow prints with clawed toes. Something had been standing there. Something had been watching them. And then, the whisper came again. Soft. Right behind them. "Let me in." The porch light went out. And the door slammed shut. Oliver barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the footprints. Every time he blinked, he felt the weight of unseen eyes watching him. The feeling of something lurking just beyond his vision clung to him like a second skin. The knocking continued every night, relentless. The scratches on the door grew deeper, more jagged, as if whatever was outside was becoming impatient. Oliver stopped checking the peephole. He stopped opening the door. But he could still hear it, hear the way the wood groaned under invisible pressure, hear the way the air outside the house seemed to shift as though something massive yet unseen was standing there. Then the whispers started. Soft at first, just barely audible under the knocks. A murmur, a breath, just beyond. Understanding. A sound that felt like it was meant for him alone. Oliver thought he was imagining it, that his exhausted brain was playing tricks on him. But then, one night, as he lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, the whisper cut through the silence like a blade. "Let me in." Oliver sat up so fast he nearly fell out of bed. His breath came in sharp gasps, and his skin was clammy with sweat. The knocking came again, louder than ever. Bang, bang, bang. It rattled the walls. It made the floorboards tremble. And then, the whisper followed, curling around the edges of his mind like smoke. "Let me in." Oliver's stomach twisted. He grabbed his phone with shaking hands, scrolling through his contacts. He needed to call someone. He needed someone, anyone, to hear this. Before he could press a button, the knocking stopped. For the first time in weeks, silence filled the house. But Oliver didn't feel relieved. He felt watched. And when he turned his head toward the darkest corner of his bedroom, the shadows seemed just a little too thick, a little too deep, a little too alive. Oliver couldn't take it anymore. He decided that tonight, he would stay up with every single light in the house turned on. The lamps, the ceiling lights, even the glow from his computer screen. He wouldn't answer the door. He wouldn't look outside. He wouldn't acknowledge it. 2:59 a.m. Oliver sat in the living room, gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his fingers ached. The TV was on, playing an old sitcom, but he wasn't watching. He wasn't even blinking. 3 a.m. The knock came. Knock, knock, knock. Oliver clenched his jaw, staring straight ahead. The knocking grew louder. Bang, bang, bang. The entire house seemed to shudder. The walls groaned. The ceiling creaked. The lights flickered. Then the whisper came. This time it wasn't outside the door. It was right next to his ear. "You should have opened the door." Oliver whipped around, his heart pounding so hard it made him feel sick. Nothing. There was nothing there. But his blood ran cold. The knock hadn't come from the front door this time. It had come from inside the house. His breath hitched. His eyes darted toward the hallway. The air felt wrong, thick, heavy, suffocating. The shadows along the walls seemed darker, stretching unnaturally as if they had grown longer in the flickering light. And then, slowly, so slowly that Oliver thought he might be imagining it, one of the shadows moved. A shape, tall and thin, peeled itself away from the darkness. It stood at the edge of the hallway, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. His eyes were empty voids, black, endless. Watching him, Oliver couldn't move. The thing smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far, filled with too many teeth. The lights flickered again. Then they went out, and Oliver screamed. The next morning, Daniel arrived at Oliver's house, knocking on the door. No answer. He frowned and knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. With a growing sense of unease, Daniel pulled out his phone and called Oliver's number. The line rang and rang until it eventually went to voicemail. Something felt wrong. Daniel hesitated for only a second before reaching for the doorknob. It was unlocked. His stomach twisted. Slowly, he pushed the door open. The house was silent, cold. The air felt thick, heavy, unnatural. A quiet so deep it felt as if the entire house was holding its breath. "Oliver." Daniel's voice echoed slightly, unnaturally. He took slow steps into the living room. The chair where Oliver had been sitting was empty. The TV was still on, the glow of the screen, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The remote lay on the floor as if someone had dropped it in a hurry, but Oliver was gone. Daniel's pulse quickened as he turned toward the front door, and stopped. 3 fresh scratches marred the wood, deeper than before, the grooves cutting through as if something with claws had carved them there. And beneath them, written in smeared, blackened marks, were 2 words. 2 words that sent a chill down Daniel's spine, that made the air in his lungs feel like ice. "Let me in." The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. A full moon hung low in the sky, casting eerie silver light over the old graveyard on the outskirts of town. The place had always been the center of ghost stories, the kind that parents told their kids to keep them from wandering too far at night. But for Jake, Lena, Ryan, and Ashley, it was just another challenge. "Come on, it's just a graveyard. What's the worst that could happen?" Jake smirked, shoving his hands into the pockets of his hoodie. Lena rolled her eyes, shifting nervously on her feet. "You say that now, but if we get caught trespassing, it's your fault." Ryan, the self-proclaimed ghost expert of the group, grinned. I heard the caretaker doesn't even check this place at night. Besides, people say it's haunted. Wouldn't it be cool to see if it's true? His voice held a thrill that the others didn't quite share. Ashley hugged herself. I don't know, guys. Sneaking into a graveyard at midnight feels wrong. Oh, come on, Ash. Jake nudged her with his elbow. It's just for fun. What? You scared? Ashley glared at him. I didn't say that. Then let's go. The four teenagers squeezed through the rusted bars of the cemetery gate, their feet crunching against dead leaves and gravel. The cemetery was old, one of the oldest in town. Cracked. Tombstones jutted out of the earth at odd angles, their names and dates barely legible from years of erosion. Some graves had sunken into the ground, the soil disturbed as if something had clawed its way out. The deeper they went, the more suffocating the air became. The scent of rotting wood and damp moss clung to their noses. The wind whistled through the bare branches of the ancient trees, creating a sound almost like whispers. Lena hugged her arms. I don't like this place. Jake scoffed. It's just an old cemetery. What's there to be afraid of? Ashley stopped suddenly. Her skin prickled with an unnatural chill. Did you hear that? Jake chuckled. Nice try. You're not scaring me. Ryan, however, had gone pale. No, I heard it too. A whisper. Soft. Faint. Calling a name. Lena. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She spun around, scanning the darkness. Who said that? No one answered. The wind howled, but underneath it, the whisper came again. Ryan. Ryan stiffened. Okay. Who's messing with us? His voice was tight, forced. Ashley's fingers dug into his arm. It's not funny. Stop. I swear it's not me. Jake raised his hands. I didn't say anything. Then they heard it again. Jake! A breathy whisper, drifting from the graves. The voice was neither male nor female, just a sound like wind through hollow bones. Ashley's eyes widened in terror. Let's get out of here. Lena turned to run, but then, Ashley! The whisper came from directly behind her. She whirled around, expecting to see someone standing there. But there was no one, just rows of old, crumbling tombstones. The air grew colder. The wind stopped. The night was silent, dead silent. Ashley's breath came in quick, shallow gasps. We have to leave. Now. Jake, normally the fearless one, looked shaken. Yeah, okay. Let's go. They turned back toward the entrance and stopped. The gate they had squeezed through was gone. In its place was a solid, rusted iron fence. No opening. No exit. What the hell? Lena whispered, panic creeping into her voice. Ryan ran to the bars, gripping them so hard his knuckles turned white. He shook them, but they didn't budge. This isn't possible. We just came through here. The whispers returned. This time they were all around them. Stay. Don't go. We've been waiting. Ashley pressed her hands over her ears. Who are you? She cried. The voices overlapped, blending together in a sickening harmony. You forgot us. You left us behind. You must remember. Shadows shifted between the tombstones. Shapes moved in the darkness. Ryan's voice cracked. We don't know you. Then, a deep, rumbling voice answered. You will. A gust of wind slammed into them, knocking them backward. The world seemed to twist. Graves stretched higher. The trees looked like giants. The sky darkened into an abyss. And then, they weren't alone. Figures stood between the graves. Dozens of them. Pale faces. Hollow eyes. Their bodies were wrapped in tattered burial shrouds. Skin stretched. Too tight over bone. Some had gaping mouths, frozen in silent screams. Others had blackened. Hands, fingers twisted like claws. Ashley clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a sob. Lena stepped back, her whole body trembling. This isn't real. This can't be real. One of the figures stepped forward. A woman, her face half decayed, eyes milky white. She dragged her feet as she moved, her skeletal fingers twitching. You left us behind. she whispered. Jake shook his head violently. We don't know you. We've never been here before. The woman tilted her head, her jaw creaking as she grinned. Not you. Them. She raised a bony finger, pointing behind them. Slowly, as if controlled by some unseen force, they turned. More figures stood behind them, but these were different. They looked exactly like them. Duplicates. Twins. Their own faces, staring back at them. Ashley's doppelganger had empty black eyes. Lena's double had a twisted, eerie grin. Ryan's copy was missing a chunk of flesh from his cheek, exposing bone. And Jake's mirror image was staring, motionless. His lips parted as if he were about to speak. Then, all at once, the copies whispered in unison. It's your turn. The ground beneath them trembled. The graves yawned open. Hands, rotting skeletal hands, burst from the dirt, grabbing their ankles. Ashley screamed as she was yanked downward, her nails clawing at the earth. Lena kicked and thrashed, but the grip was too strong. Ryan and Jake struggled, their voices rising in sheer terror. The doppelgangers stepped closer, reaching out. Their fingers sank into the teen's skin, merging with them, pulling them into the grave. Darkness swallowed them whole. The graveyard fell silent once more. The wind picked up, the trees whispered, and 4 new figures stood among the tombstones. Pale faces, hollow eyes, waiting for the next visitors to enter the graveyard, to hear the whispers, to take their place. The ghostly copies of the 4 teenagers stood motionless, their hollow expressions eerily, mirroring their own. Their eyes, dull and lifeless, seemed to pierce right through them. Then all at once, they spoke in a whispering chorus. You left us here. Ashley's heart pounded violently against her ribs. I don't understand, she choked out, her voice barely above a whisper. The first ghostly figure, the woman with the decayed face, stepped forward. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if the air around her resisted her existence. Long ago, she rasped, her voice layered with sorrow. We were just like you, young, alive. We came here on a dare, just as you did. And then? She paused, her milky eyes glancing at the darkened sky. We were taken. Ryan's throat was dry. Taken by what? He asked, though deep down he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. A gust of wind swept through the cemetery, kicking up a cloud of dead leaves. The ground seemed to shudder beneath their feet. Then, out of the darkness, something shifted. Between the graves, a shadow emerged. It was impossibly tall, taller than the trees, its form a writhing mass of shifting darkness. The longer they looked at it, the harder it was to focus, as if their eyes refused to comprehend what they were seeing. A deep, guttural voice slithered through the air, colder than the wind. I am the keeper of the forgotten, the lost, the abandoned. The weight of its presence pressed down on them, making it harder to breathe. The air around them grew thick, suffocating. Ashley gripped Lena's arm, her fingernails digging into her friend's skin. We don't belong here, she gasped. The shadow laughed, a low, hollow sound that sent chills up their spines. You came willingly. Now you will stay. The wind roared again. The figures lunged forward, their outstretched hands like skeletal claws, reaching for them. Their whispering voices turned desperate, frantic. Stay with us. We were forgotten. Don't leave us behind. Ashley screamed. Lena yanked her hand, dragging her backward. Run! They bolted. But the graveyard was no longer what it had been. The paths twisted like a maze. Tombstones shifted before their eyes, blocking their way. The gate, their only exit, was gone. No matter which direction they ran, they always ended up back at the center of the cemetery, right where the thing was waiting, and it was getting closer. The ghostly figures closed in, their icy fingers inches from their skin. Their whispers turned to hissing voices, each breath echoing like a death rattle. Ashley's chest heaved. Her body trembled violently as she clung to Ryan's arm. We're trapped, she sobbed. There's no way out. Jake's eyes darted around desperately, searching, hoping for anything. A break in the tombstones, a hidden passage, a glimmer of hope. And then, he saw it. A grave. A freshly dug grave. The soil was dark, damp, and disturbed as if something had just been buried, or was waiting to be buried. And on the tombstone above it, their names: Ashley Carter, Lena Brooks, Jake Turner, Ryan Wells. A chill ran through his spine as he read the inscription below their names. Died on October 31st. Buried before they even knew they were dead. No, no, no. Ashley stumbled back, shaking her head violently. This can't be real. We're not dead. We're not dead. Ryan's hands clenched into fists. His mind raced. There had to be a way out. There had to be. His eyes locked onto a jagged rock near the grave. His fingers closed around it and without thinking, he lifted it high above his head and smashed it against the tombstone. Crack. The marble split in two. Instantly, the ground trembled. A piercing scream, louder than anything they had ever heard, ripped through the night. The ghosts wailed, their bodies convulsing as they shrieked in agony. The shadows recoiled, twisting violently as if in pain. The air itself seemed to bend and warp. Around them, the wind howled, stronger than before. The trees groaned, the earth beneath them splitting open. Then, everything went black. The next thing they knew, they were standing outside the cemetery. The rusted gate was wide open. The full moon still hung in the sky. The night was still, silent. No whispers, no figures, no shadows. Just an empty graveyard, looking as ordinary as ever. The four of them gasped for air, their bodies trembling from exhaustion and fear. Ryan turned to the others. His voice was barely a whisper. Did that just happen? No one answered. Instead, they ran. Ran as fast as they could, away from that place. Away from the horrors they had witnessed. And they never spoke about that night again. But sometimes, when they walked past the old graveyard, they swore they could still hear it. A whisper, calling their names, waiting. Lily Parker had always loved dolls. Ever since she was little, she had a collection that filled an entire shelf in her bedroom. Each doll was unique. Some had button eyes, others had soft fabric bodies, and a few were made of porcelain. But among them, there was one doll that was special, her absolute favorite. It was a beautiful porcelain doll with long golden hair, icy blue eyes, and a delicate pink dress, made of lace. Her tiny hands were perfectly sculpted, her face painted with the gentlest expression. She had soft, rosy cheeks and eyelashes so delicate that they looked almost real. The doll had been a gift from her grandmother on her 8th birthday. From the moment Lily held her, she felt an unusual attachment to her. There was something about Annabelle that felt different. It wasn't just a toy. It almost felt like a friend, someone who was always watching over her. Unlike her other dolls, which sometimes collected dust from being untouched, Annabelle was always with Lily, whether on her bed, at her desk, or in her arms while she read. Lily named her Annabelle. At first, Annabelle was just like the rest of her dolls, sitting neatly on the shelf watching over Lily as she played or slept. Lily would brush her hair every night and make sure her dress was neat before tucking herself into bed. She loved Annabelle. But as the weeks passed, strange things started happening. Annabelle wouldn't stay in one place. First, it was small things. Lily would set her on the shelf at night, but in the morning she would find her sitting on her desk. Sometimes, she'd leave Annabelle in her toy box, only to come back and see her lying on the bed as if she had been placed there. Lily didn't pay much attention at first. Maybe she had forgotten where she put her. Maybe her mother had moved her while cleaning. But then, it started happening every single day. One afternoon, after coming home from school, Lily was horrified to find Annabelle sitting on the windowsill, her blue eyes staring blankly outside. Lily's stomach twisted. She was sure she had left Annabelle on the shelf before going to school. A thought struck her. "Max," she called. storming into her younger brother's room. Max, who was lying on the floor playing with his toy cars, barely looked up. "What?" Lily held up the doll. "Stop moving my doll," she snapped. "It's not funny." Max scrunched his nose. "I didn't touch your creepy doll." Lily frowned. "Then how did she get there?" Max shrugged. "Maybe she moved on her own." Lily rolled her eyes. "Dolls don't move on their own." But deep down, she wasn't so sure anymore. That night, Lily made sure Annabelle was sitting properly on the shelf before she went to sleep. She even whispered, "Stay here, okay?" As if the doll could actually listen. Her room was dimly lit by the glow of her nightlight. She had always liked sleeping with a little light on, but tonight the shadows in the room felt deeper. The corners of the room stretched, darker than usual. Lily pulled the covers up to her chin and closed her eyes. But sleep didn't come easily. She tossed and turned for hours, feeling restless. Every so often, she would open her eyes and glance at the shelf, just to make sure Annabelle was still there. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and Lily drifted into a light sleep. Then, in the middle of the night, something stirred. A soft sound, like fabric brushing against wood. Lily shifted under the blankets, half asleep. Then, a thump. Her eyes flew open. Her breath caught in her throat. Something was in the room with her. Slowly, hesitantly, she turned her head toward the shelf. Annabelle was gone. Lily's chest tightened. Her fingers gripped the blanket as she forced herself to sit up. The room was silent, except for the sound of her own breathing. Her gaze swept across the room, and then she saw it. Annabelle, sitting on her pillow, inches from her face. Lily's heart slammed against her ribs. "How?" Her fingers trembled as she reached out and grabbed the doll. Her porcelain skin felt colder than usual, almost like ice. Lily bolted upright and hurriedly placed Annabelle back on the shelf, her hands shaking. She told herself it was nothing. Maybe she had moved it in her sleep without realizing. Maybe she had sleepwalked, but then it kept happening. Day after day, no matter where she placed Annabelle, the doll would always end up somewhere else. Sometimes it was just a few feet away. Other times she would be across the room. Once, Lily left Annabelle inside her closet, shutting the door tightly. She even placed a heavy box in front of it just to make sure it wouldn't open. The next morning, the closet was wide open, and Annabelle was sitting at Lily's desk, facing the bed. That was the first time Lily felt truly afraid. One evening, as Lily was brushing her hair in front of the mirror, she swore she saw something move in the reflection. It was just a flicker, a small shift of light in the background. She froze. Her eyes darted toward the shelf. Annabelle was still there, sitting perfectly still. Lily's throat was dry. She turned around slowly, scanning the room. Nothing. She exhaled shakily. "I'm just imagining things," she whispered to herself. But that night she had trouble sleeping. The room felt colder than usual. The air was heavy, almost like something was watching her. Every small creak of the house made her heart race. The rustling of the trees outside sounded like whispering voices. Then, a whisper, soft, almost too quiet to hear. "Lily." Lily's eyes snapped open. Her stomach turned to ice. Had she imagined it? Or had someone really whispered her name? Slowly, she turned her head toward the shelf. Annabelle was gone. A shuffling sound came from the floor. Lily's pulse pounded in her ears. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she reached for her phone, her fingers fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The light flickered on, and there, in the beam, Annabelle, sitting on the carpet, facing her. Her cold blue eyes seemed to glisten in the dim light. Her porcelain lips slightly parted as if she was about to speak. Lily screamed. Her parents rushed in moments later, switching on the lights. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" her mom asked, her voice filled with concern. Lily pointed at the doll, her whole body trembling. She moved. Her dad sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Lily, it's just a doll." He picked up Annabelle and placed her back on the shelf. Maybe you knocked her over in your sleep. Lily shook her head, but she didn't argue, because deep down she already knew. Annabelle had moved on her own, and she wasn't going to stop. Lily had never been this scared before. Annabelle wasn't just moving. She was doing things that Lily couldn't explain. She needed to talk to someone who would listen. The next day at school, she pulled her best friend, Sophie, aside during lunch. They sat on the farthest bench in the playground, away from everyone else. The autumn wind blew through the trees, making the branches creak. Lily hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and told Sophie everything. Sophie listened in silence, her face growing paler with every word. When Lily finished, Sophie shook her head. "Lily, that's not normal," she whispered. What if the doll is haunted?" Lily forced out a laugh, but it sounded weak. "That's ridiculous. She's just a doll." Sophie didn't laugh. "Dolls don't move on their own." Lily's stomach twisted. She wanted to believe it was all in her head, that maybe her brother was playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew the truth. Sophie leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "My grandma used to tell me stories about spirits, attaching themselves to objects, especially dolls. You should get rid of it, Lily, before it's too late." Lily frowned. "Just throw her away?" "No. You have to do it properly," Sophie insisted. "You can't just toss it in the trash. If it's really haunted, it'll come back." Lily swallowed. "Then what should I do?" Sophie hesitated. "Bury it. Far away. Somewhere it won't be found." Lily shivered. The idea of burying Annabelle felt wrong, almost like she was doing something bad. But at this point, she was willing to try anything. That night, she made a decision. She would lock Annabelle in a box. After dinner, Lily rushed to her room and found an old shoebox. Her hands trembled as she picked Annabelle up, holding the doll as far away from her body as possible. For the first time, she noticed how cold Annabelle felt, almost like she had been sitting outside in the winter air. Taking a deep breath, Lily placed Annabelle inside the shoebox, shut the lid tightly, and wrapped layers of tape around it. She shoved the box under her bed, making sure it was completely hidden. "There," she muttered. "Now you can't move anymore." She climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin. The room was silent, too silent. After what felt like hours, her eyelids grew heavy, and she drifted off to sleep. But in the middle of the night, thump, Lily's eyes snapped open. Thump, thump, something was moving under her bed. Her breath hitched in her throat. Scrape, something was crawling. Slowly, hesitantly, she leaned over the side of her bed and peered down into the darkness. The shoebox was there, but the lid, it was open, empty. Lily's blood ran cold. And then, a soft giggle, a childlike whisper, echoing through the dark. Her heart pounded as she turned her head, barely able to breathe. Annabelle was sitting on her nightstand, but this time she wasn't the same. Her head was tilted slightly to the side. Her painted lips were curled into the faintest of smiles. Her tiny porcelain hand was raised, like she was waving. Lily let out a scream that shook the entire house. Within seconds, her parents rushed in, turning on the lights. "What's wrong?" her mom asked, eyes wide with concern. Lily couldn't speak. She could only point, her hand trembling. Her dad sighed when he saw the doll. "Lily, you have to stop with these stories. It's just a doll." "No," Lily choked out. She moved. She got out of the box." Her dad shook his head and picked up Annabelle, placing her back on the shelf. "You probably knocked it over in your sleep." Lily knew that wasn't true. Annabelle had moved on her own, and she wasn't going to stop. Lily couldn't take it anymore. She had tried everything, ignoring Annabelle, locking her in a box, even begging her to stop. But the doll wouldn't stop. She kept moving, creeping closer and closer to Lily's bed each night. And now she was smiling. That was the last straw. Lily grabbed her backpack and stuffed Annabelle inside. She didn't care if her parents got mad. She didn't care if it was late. She was getting rid of the doll tonight. The house was silent as she tiptoed to the front door. Her parents were asleep and she needed to keep it that way. Slipping on her jacket, she carefully opened the door and stepped outside. The wind howled through the trees, sending a shiver down her spine. The woods behind their neighborhood loomed in the distance, dark and endless. Her hands shook as she walked toward them. The farther she went, the harder her heart pounded. Finally, she stopped in a small clearing. The ground was soft from the recent rain, making it easier to dig. She dropped to her knees and began scooping dirt away with her hands. Her fingers were freezing, but she didn't care. Minutes passed. Then, finally, the hole was deep enough. Lily pulled Annabelle out of her backpack. The doll's blue eyes seemed to shine in the moonlight, almost alive. Her breath hitched. She swore Annabelle's smile had grown wider. "Stay here," Lily whispered, placing the doll in the hole. She quickly covered her with dirt, patting the ground down as tightly as possible. Then she ran. She didn't look back. For the first time in weeks, she slept peacefully. But in the morning, her heart nearly stopped. Annabelle was back, sitting on her bed. Her dress was covered in dirt, and carved into the wood of the headboard, in jagged, uneven letters, was a single word. "Why?" Lily screamed. Desperate, she called her grandmother, the one who had given her the doll. Her grandmother was silent for a long moment. Then she spoke. "Lily, listen to me carefully," she said. "Annabelle isn't just a doll. She once belonged to a little girl named Eleanor, a girl who died many years ago. Her spirit, it's attached to the doll." Lily's heart pounded. "What do I do?" Her grandmother hesitated. "You must return her to where she belongs." That night, Lily followed her grandmother's instructions. She took Annabelle back to an old, forgotten graveyard at the edge of town. She found Eleanor's grave, weathered, covered in moss. With trembling hands, she placed Annabelle on the grave and whispered, "You're home now." The wind picked up. The air grew still. For a moment, Lily swore she saw something. A shadow, a figure of a little girl, smiling at her. Then the wind carried it away. Lily never saw Annabelle again, and she never heard the whispers. But sometimes, when she passed by the graveyard, she felt eyes watching her, waiting. The streets were eerily silent. Rajesh yawned, rubbing his tired eyes as he steered his old taxi through the dimly lit roads of the city. The digital clock on the dashboard glowed 2:47 a.m. in red, a stark reminder of how late it was. The air outside was crisp, carrying the damp scent of the nearby river, and an unsettling stillness hung in the air. It was an odd night. Usually, at this hour, the roads weren't completely deserted. There would be the occasional drunken men stumbling out of bars, exhausted laborers trudging home, couples whispering quietly in the back seat of his taxi. But tonight there was no one. The flickering street lights cast elongated shadows on the asphalt, making everything feel surreal. Rajesh's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He was used to working late nights, but something about this shift felt different, wrong. Even the glowing red numbers on the meter told him he was close to his target earnings for the night. Just one more ride and he could go home, crawl into bed next to his wife, and wake up to his kids' laughter in the morning. That thought was the only thing keeping him awake. The taxi rattled slightly as he approached an old intersection. The roads stretched into the distance, empty and silent, swallowed by the thick fog rolling in from the riverbanks. The mist moved in an unnatural way, swirling slowly, almost deliberately, like unseen hands trying to take shape. Then, out of nowhere, a lone figure emerged from the fog. Rajesh's heart lurched as his foot instinctively hit the brakes. The tires screeched slightly on the damp road. The man stood perfectly still under the flickering yellow glow of a street lamp. He was dressed in an old-fashioned white kurta and loose pajama pants, the kind Rajesh had seen his grandfather wear in old photographs. His clothes were spotless, but there was something strangely dated about them. His face was obscured by shadows, but from what Rajesh could see, his features were sharp, his posture unnaturally stiff, like he didn't quite belong in this world. Rajesh hesitated. He had picked up all sorts of passengers before, some weird, some unsettling, but none had ever made his stomach twist in this way. There was something off about this man. He should drive away. He wanted to drive away, but he needed the fare. Rajesh took a deep breath, forcing a casual tone as he rolled down the window slightly. Need a ride? Sob. The man turned his head toward Rajesh in a slow, deliberate motion. His eyes, dark, sunken, empty, locked onto Rajesh's. A long silence. Then, in a soft voice, almost a whisper, he spoke. Take me to the cemetery. Rajesh's fingers instinctively gripped the steering wheel tighter. The cemetery? At this hour? He forced a nervous chuckle, hoping to mask the growing unease in his chest. The cemetery? What are you doing there so late, Sob? The man didn't answer. He reached for the back door and slipped inside. The air in the taxi changed instantly. A sudden, inexplicable coldness settled in the car, unnatural for a summer night. Rajesh shivered despite himself. He glanced at the rearview mirror. The passenger sat stiffly in the middle of the back seat, his hands resting neatly on his lap. His posture was too straight, too rigid, like someone trying too hard to appear normal. Rajesh swallowed, trying to ignore the way his skin prickled. Maybe he's just a strange guy. Maybe he was visiting a loved one's grave. That happened sometimes, didn't it? Still, something felt wrong. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to sound casual. Sob, do you live near the cemetery? Silence. Rajesh checked the mirror again. The man was still staring straight ahead, unmoving, unblinking. A cold sweat formed on the back of Rajesh's neck. He turned his attention back to the road, forcing himself to focus on driving. The fog thickened around them, swirling like ghostly tendrils, wrapping around the car as if trying to pull it into the night. The further they drove, the darker the roads became. Street lights were scarce, and those that remained flickered weakly, barely piercing the dense mist. It felt like they were leaving the city behind, entering a different world. One where time moved, differently where shadows watched in silence. Rajesh's heartbeat quickened. His fingers trembled against the steering wheel. He had been driving this route for years. He knew these roads like the back of his hand. But tonight, they felt different. Something was not right. The taxi rattled as it turned onto the narrow dirt road leading to the cemetery. The iron gates loomed ahead, tall and rusted, their jagged edges reaching toward the night sky, like skeletal fingers. Beyond them, the graveyard stretched into the darkness, a sea of crumbling headstones and forgotten memories. Rajesh's stomach twisted into knots. He hated this place. The wind howled through the trees, whispering secrets he didn't want to hear. The mist had thickened into an almost solid wall, pressing against the taxi like something alive. The headlights flickered, barely illuminating the road ahead. Rajesh swallowed hard. Just drop him off and leave. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to speak. Sob, we're here. No response. Rajesh's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. A growing sense of dread curled in his gut. He turned around. The back seat was empty. His breath caught in his throat. No, 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 no. His hands fumbled for the door handle as panic set in. He turned fully, eyes wide, scanning the seat. He had seen the man get in. He had felt his presence. He had driven him all the way here. And now he is gone. Rajesh's heart pounded against his ribs. His mouth went dry. His brain struggled to make sense of it. Had he imagined the whole thing? Then, from the corner of his eye, a movement outside. A shadow drifted past the gates. Rajesh's stomach dropped. His hands trembled as he grabbed his phone, switching on the flashlight. The pale beam cut through the fog, landing on the nearest gravestone. It was cracked, worn with time, but the name on it, Rajesh's body went cold. The name on the grave was the same name the passenger had given him. His breath hitched. His pulse thundered in his ears. Then, as if carried by the wind, a voice whispered through the trees. "Thank you for the ride." Rajesh's entire body froze. His throat clenched, and his hands turned ice cold. His eyes darted wildly around the cemetery, his breathing uneven. He had to get out of here. Rajesh fumbled with the keys, trying to start the engine. The old taxi sputtered, refused to start. And then, in the rearview mirror, a pair of dark, hollow eyes stared back at him. Rajesh's scream tore through the night. Rajesh's breath came in short, ragged gasps. His entire body felt frozen, as if the very air around him had turned into ice. His heart hammered violently against his ribs, each beat drumming the same terrifying thought into his head. This is not possible. He stared at the gravestone, his hands trembling as he brought the flashlight closer. The name carved into the stone was the same name the man had given him. But what made his stomach lurch was the date. The man had died 20 years ago. His knees nearly buckled. He took an unsteady step backward, the fog swirling around him, thick and suffocating. The night air was eerily silent, yet a strange presence lingered, pressing against his skin like unseen eyes watching from every direction. Then, from the depths of the mist, a whisper floated through the air, soft, almost gentle, but chilling in its familiarity. "Thank you for the ride." Rajesh's breath hitched in his throat. His fingers numbed. His body screamed for him to run. But fear had him rooted to the ground. And then he felt it, the sudden bone-deep chill, an unnatural cold creeping over his shoulders, slithering down his spine. His instincts screamed. Something was behind him. Summoning every ounce of courage he had left, Rajesh turned. Nothing. But the mist shifted, swirling unnaturally, as if something unseen had just moved. Panic took over. He stumbled back toward the taxi, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the door handle. The metal was ice-cold beneath his touch. He yanked the door open and threw himself inside, slamming it shut behind him. His chest heaved as he jammed the key into the ignition, his hands trembling so badly he could barely turn it. The old taxi sputtered, groaning in protest. "Come on, come on." The engine coughed, refused, then finally roared to life. Rajesh gripped the wheel, slamming his foot on the accelerator. The tires screeched against the gravel, kicking up dust as he sped away from the cemetery. His breath was erratic, his heart still hammering, but relief started to trickle in. He was safe. He was getting out of here. But then, the road stretched endlessly ahead of him. He knew this road. He had driven it countless times. Yet, something was wrong. The surroundings seemed unfamiliar, distorted. The fog pressed against the windows like unseen, hands growing thicker, denser, as if trying to pull him back. And then, a prickle of cold dread crawled up his neck. Something made him glance at the rearview mirror. And that's when he saw it. His breath caught in his throat. A face, sitting in the back seat exactly where he had been before. Unmoving, expressionless, hollow, dark eyes staring straight at him through the mirror. Rajesh's scream tore through the night. His hands jerked the wheel. The car skidded wildly, tires screeching against the gravel. His vision blurred with panic as he swerved. And then, darkness, a distant voice, muffled, blurred, familiar. Rajesh's head throbbed, a deep, pounding ache that felt like someone was hammering inside his skull. His body was heavy, each limb sluggish and weak. He forced his eyes open. The harsh morning light stabbed through his vision, making him wince. The sterile white of a hospital ceiling swam above him. The sharp scent of antiseptic filled his nose. His breath came in slow, shallow gasps. His entire body ached, his muscles stiff, as if he had been frozen in fear for hours. "Bia, you're awake." A voice, his younger brother, Arun. Relief was evident in his tone. His wife stood beside him, worry etched into every line on her face. Rajesh blinked, his throat dry and scratchy. He tried to sit up, but his body protested, every muscle screaming in pain. What happened? His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Arun exhaled shakily. You were found unconscious on the cemetery road. Your taxi crashed into a tree. The cemetery. Rajesh's breath hitched. The memories rushed back like a flood. The strange passenger. The fog. The gravestone. The face in the mirror. His fingers curled into the bedsheet, his knuckles turning white. He forced himself to ask the question that had been clawing at his mind. Did anyone find a man in my taxi? Arun frowned, his expression turning confused. Bia, there was no one in the taxi. Just you. Rajesh felt the blood drain from his face. His stomach lurched. No, that wasn't possible. He had seen him. He had spoken to him. He had felt his presence. His breath grew unsteady, his chest tightening. His hands shook as he grabbed Arun's arm. Check my rearview mirror. Arun gave him a puzzled look but nodded. Okay, I'll ask someone to check. Minutes passed in tense silence. The room felt colder, suffocating. A strange heaviness settled in Rajesh's chest. Then the nurse entered, holding something in her hands. A shattered piece of glass. The rearview mirror. Rajesh's breath caught. Something was carved into the surface. Deep, jagged. See you again. A chill ran down his spine. His fingers went numb. And then, for just a second, he saw the reflection. The hollow, dark eyes staring back at him. Unblinking. Waiting. And then, the reflection smiled. No one in the neighborhood ever talked about the house at the end of Blackwood Street. It had been empty for nearly 3 decades, its windows covered in dust, the paint peeling off its once white walls, and the front yard overgrown with wild grass. Some claimed they had seen shadows moving inside at night. Others swore they had heard whispers when they walked past it. But no one dared to go near it. That was until the Carter family moved in. Daniel and Sarah Carter had been looking for a house within their budget, and when they stumbled upon the listing for the Blackwood Street property, they couldn't believe their luck. A large Victorian house with a spacious yard, offered at a price much lower than anything else in the city. It seemed like a dream come true. The real estate agent hesitated when they inquired about it, mumbling something about the house being difficult to sell. But when they insisted, he finally agreed to a showing. The moment they stepped inside, Sarah felt an odd chill run down her spine. The air was heavy, carrying a strange dampness that shouldn't have been there in a house that had been locked up for years. Dust floated in the dim light seeping through the old curtains, and the wooden floor creaked under their footsteps. But none of that mattered to Daniel. He was too focused on the potential. A little cleaning, a fresh coat of paint, and this place will be perfect, he had said, squeezing Sarah's hand. Their 8-year-old son, Michael, wasn't as thrilled. He clung to Sarah's side, his wide eyes scanning the dark corners of the house. Mom, I don't like it here, he whispered. It smells bad. Sarah knelt beside him, brushing his dark curls away from his forehead. It's just an old house, sweetheart. Once we clean it up, it will feel like home. Michael didn't argue, but he kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting something or someone to appear. They moved in the following week. The first few days were spent dusting, scrubbing, and unpacking. Daniel worked late shifts at his new job, leaving Sarah alone with Michael most evenings. That was when the strange things began happening. At first, it was subtle. The kitchen faucet would start dripping even though Sarah was sure she had turned it off. The lights flickered, but she dismissed it as faulty wiring. Michael complained that he heard footsteps in the hallway at night, but Daniel assured him it was just the old pipes settling. Then, one night, Sarah woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost like the wind blowing through the trees, but the words were unmistakable. Soft, hushed voices, overlapping, murmuring in a language she didn't understand. She sat up, her heart pounding. Daniel was sound asleep beside her. She held her breath and listened. The whispers grew louder. Sarah turned toward the bedroom door. It was slightly open, revealing the dark hallway beyond. For a moment, she thought she saw movement, a shadow shifting against the dim light of the night. But when she blinked, it was gone. Shaking off the unease, she lay back down, telling herself it was just her imagination. The next morning, Michael refused to come out of his room. When Sarah finally coaxed him downstairs for breakfast, he wouldn't eat. His small fingers clutched the edge of the table, his face pale. "What's wrong, baby?" Sarah asked, kneeling beside him. He hesitated before whispering, "There's a lady in my room." Sarah felt a chill creep up her spine. "What do you mean?" Michael glanced toward the staircase, as if making sure no one was listening. "She stands in the corner at night. She has no eyes." Sarah swallowed hard. "Michael, that's just a bad dream. There's no lady." Michael shook his head. "She whispers to me." Sarah forced a smile, trying to keep her voice steady. "What does she say?" Michael hesitated, then murmured, "She says she wants to come inside." Sarah's stomach twisted. That night, she stayed up late, sitting in the hallway outside Michael's room. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Just as she was about to head to bed, a cold gust of air rushed past her. The hallway light flickered. Sarah's breath hitched as she turned toward Michael's door. It was open. Her heart pounded as she stepped inside. The room was empty except for Michael, fast asleep in his bed. But something felt wrong. The air was thick, suffocating. And then she saw it. In the corner, where the shadows were darkest, a shape was standing. Tall, motionless, watching. Sarah gasped, stumbling backward, her hand flying to the light switch. The moment the light flickered on, the figure was gone. The room was empty. She barely slept that night. The next day, she called Daniel at work, her voice trembling as she explained what had happened. He tried to calm her, suggesting it was just stress. But she could hear the doubt in his voice. Then the nightmares began. Sarah dreamt of a woman in a tattered black dress, standing at the foot of her bed, whispering in a language she didn't understand. She would wake up drenched in sweat, her body frozen, unable to move for several minutes. Michael's behavior worsened. He refused to sleep in his room, begging to stay in Sarah and Daniel's bed. One night, as Sarah tucked him in, he suddenly grabbed her hand, his eyes wide with fear. "She's angry, Mom," he whispered. "She says we need to leave." That was the final straw. Sarah spent the entire night researching the house's history. What she found made her blood run cold. 30 years ago, a woman named Margaret Holloway had lived there. A widow, she had become reclusive after losing her husband and child in a fire. Neighbors claimed she had started speaking to someone who wasn't there, muttering in the dead of night. One evening, she was found hanging from the attic beams. Her last words, scribbled on the wall in her own blood, read, "She is in the shadows. She will not let me leave." Sarah slammed her laptop shut, bile rising in her throat. That night, she told Daniel everything. He finally agreed they needed to leave. They packed their bags, planning to stay at a hotel until they found a new place. But the house wouldn't let them go so easily. As Sarah gathered their things, a sudden violent banging echoed through the house. The lights flickered wildly. A cold wind howled through the hallways, though every window was shut. And then Michael screamed. Sarah and Daniel ran to his room. The sight that met them was one they would never forget. Michael stood in the middle of his room, staring at the wall. The words "Don't leave" were scratched into the plaster, deep and jagged, as if carved by invisible claws. And then the whispering began again, louder this time, more urgent. Sarah grabbed Michael, Daniel yanked open the front door, and they ran. They never went back. A week later, the house was found abandoned again. The words on Michael's wall had vanished. But some nights, when the wind is still, neighbors say they can still hear whispering coming from inside. And sometimes, if you look closely, you can see a figure standing by the window, watching, waiting, for someone new to move in. The Carters never spoke of what happened that night. They checked into a motel on the outskirts of town, too shaken to think clearly. Michael refused to sleep alone, clinging to Sarah every time she tried to move away. Even Daniel, always the rational one, lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his face pale in the dim light of the bedside lamp. The next morning, Sarah called the real estate agent. She didn't bother with excuses. "We're leaving the house. Sell it, burn it, I don't care. We're not going back." The agent sighed on the other end of the line. "You're not the first ones to say that." Sarah gripped the phone tighter. "Then why the hell do you keep selling it?" There was a long silence. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Because it always finds new owners." Sarah's stomach twisted. She hung up without another word. That night, Michael woke up screaming. Sarah and Daniel bolted upright, their hearts racing. Michael sat on the bed, his small body trembling, tears streaming down his face. "She followed us," he sobbed. "She's outside." Daniel rushed to the window. First, there was nothing, just the empty parking lot, lit by a flickering street lamp. But then a movement, a figure barely visible in the darkness. A woman in a tattered black dress. She stood motionless, her face obscured by shadows. Then, slowly, her head tilted upward, as if sensing Daniel's gaze. The light flickered again, and she was gone. Daniel stumbled backward, his breath ragged. "We need to get out of here." They left before sunrise, driving without a destination. They ended up in another state, renting a small apartment under a different name. They never mentioned Blackwood Street again. But the nightmares never stopped. Sarah would wake up gasping for air, the echoes of whispers still ringing in her ears. Michael grew quieter, his once bright eyes now dull and distant. And Daniel changed. He started staying up late, staring at the walls as if listening to something only he could hear. Sometimes, Sarah would wake to find him standing by the window, unmoving, his eyes vacant. One night, she finally asked, "What are you looking at?" Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he whispered, "She's waiting." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Who?" Daniel slowly turned to her. "She followed us." Sarah wanted to scream, to shake him, to tell him it was all in his head. But then she saw something that made her heart stop. His shadow. It stretched unnaturally along the wall, far too long for the dim light of the lamp. And beside his shadow, another, thin, still, watching. Sarah grabbed Michael and ran. They left Daniel behind that night. She never saw him again. Years later, when she finally gathered the courage to look him up, she found an article. A man had been found in an abandoned house, sitting in a chair, staring at the wall, mouth open, eyes hollow, dead. The neighbors claimed they still heard whispers coming from inside. And sometimes, if you looked closely at the window, you could see two figures standing there, waiting for someone new. But Sarah's nightmare wasn't over. 3 nights after reading the article, she woke up to a soft rustling sound in her bedroom. Michael was asleep beside her, his tiny hands curled into fists. Her breath hitched. The rustling grew louder. The closet door creaked open. And in the darkness, just beyond the threshold, a pair of hollow eyes stared back. The last thing Sarah heard before the world went black was a whisper, "You shouldn't have left him." The end. The rain hammered the windshield as Mark gripped the steering wheel, his fingers tightening with each gust of wind that rocked his car. The empty highway stretched ahead, shrouded in mist and darkness, the white lane markers flashing like ghostly apparitions under his headlights. He had been driving for hours, his eyes burning from fatigue, and the storm showed no sign of letting up. Mark exhaled heavily, glancing at the dashboard clock. 2:47 a.m. The next town was about 30 minutes away. If he kept pushing forward, he could reach a motel before dawn and finally get some rest. His wipers struggled against the downpour, each pass barely clearing the windshield before another sheet of water obscured his vision. His eyelids felt heavier by the second. Just a little longer, he told himself. Just a little. A figure appeared on the roadside. Mark's pulse spiked. A woman stood there, barely visible in the torrential rain. She wore a white dress, now soaked and clinging to her thin frame. Her long, dark hair draped over her face, obscuring most of her features. She wasn't waving for help. She wasn't holding out a thumb. She simply stood there. A chill crept up Mark's spine. Who in their right mind would be out here at this hour, in this storm? He hesitated but instinctively eased his foot off the gas, slowing the car. He rolled the window down slightly as he pulled up beside her, the cold wind carrying a scent of rain and something faintly sweet, like old perfume. "Need a ride?" he called out over the roar of the rain. For a moment she didn't move. Then, slowly, she turned her head toward him. Mark's stomach tightened. Her face was eerily pale, her eyes too large, hollow-looking in the dim light. She blinked once, then nodded. Something about her unsettled him, but he ignored the instinctual warning buzzing in his head. It was just a storm. She was probably just cold, scared, in need of help. He reached over and unlocked the door. She slid in without a word. Mark swallowed as she settled into the seat. The scent of damp fabric and that faint floral aroma filled the car. Water dripped from her dress, forming small puddles on the seat and floor. She shivered violently, wrapping her arms around herself. "You must be freezing," Mark said, adjusting the heater. "Where are you headed?" "Hollow Creek," she murmured. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it sent a shudder down Mark's spine. He frowned. Hollow Creek? That was odd. The town had been dying for years, most of its buildings abandoned. It was the kind of place people left, not returned to. Still, he nodded and pulled back onto the road. The car's tires splashed through puddles as they drove in silence. Occasionally, he glanced at her. She sat stiffly, her gaze locked forward. Her hands trembled in her lap. He cleared his throat, trying to break the eerie quiet. "Rough night." She turned then, too slowly. Her dark eyes met his, and for a second, Mark felt like his breath had been sucked from his lungs. There was something wrong with them, like looking into a deep, endless pit. "I just want to go home." Mark's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Something about the way she said it. The way her lips barely moved, the emptiness in her tone. Made his skin prickle. The rain had settled into a light drizzle by the time they reached the outskirts of Hollow Creek. The mist thickened, curling between the skeletal trees and crumbling houses. The streetlights flickered weakly, their glow barely reaching through the dense fog. Mark swallowed. The place felt dead. "Where exactly do you live?" he asked, scanning the dimly lit street. She lifted a pale hand and pointed. Mark followed her gesture to an old Victorian house at the end of the road. His stomach dropped. The place was in ruins. The windows were black, hollow, the front porch sagging under years of neglect. Weeds had overtaken the yard, pushing up through cracks in the broken pavement. The house looked abandoned. "Are you sure?" The seat beside him was empty. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't heard the door open, hadn't felt the car shift, and yet she was gone. His hands went clammy as he turned toward the house. A shadow moved in the upstairs window. Mark's stomach twisted. A flash of lightning split the sky, and in that brief moment of brightness he saw her, standing in the upstairs window, watching him. Mark's pulse slammed against his ribs. His hands fumbled for the gear shift, yanking it into reverse. The tires screeched against the wet pavement as he sped backward. The house vanished into the mist, but the suffocating feeling of being watched didn't leave. He didn't stop until he reached a gas station on the edge of town. The fluorescent lights inside flickered weakly, casting harsh shadows over the empty aisles. Mark stumbled through the door, his heart still hammering in his chest. The old clerk behind the counter barely looked up. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Mark swallowed, his throat dry. "I think I did." The clerk's expression darkened. "You picked up a hitchhiker, didn't you?" Mark's skin turned cold. "How did you know?" The old man exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Because you're not the first." Mark's breath hitched. "What do you mean?" The clerk's gaze was heavy. "She's been dead for 20 years, drowned on her way home from prom. They found her car at the bottom of Hollow Creek Lake. But people still see her, always looking for a ride, always trying to get home." A shiver crawled up Mark's spine. Slowly, he turned toward his car, dreading what he might find. The passenger seat was empty. The door was closed. But there, on the outside of the passenger window, a single wet handprint. A whisper drifted through the air, so faint he could almost convince himself he imagined it. "I'll always find my way back." Mark barely breathed as his foot pressed the accelerator harder. The car roared forward, tearing through the silent night. The road stretched endlessly before him, the highway lights flickering, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and stretch unnaturally. Beside him, she sat eerily still. Her dress, once soaked through with rainwater, was now pristine, as if time had reversed itself. Her hands rested lightly in her lap, delicate and unmoving. She didn't fidget. She didn't blink. She simply stared straight ahead, her hollow eyes reflecting the distant glow of the headlights. Mark swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the wheel. He had seen her vanish once before, had felt the weight of her absence in the seat beside him. But now she was here again, and this time he was determined. "Hollow Creek?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, the movement slow, almost mechanical. Mark exhaled and made his choice. Not tonight. He yanked the wheel slightly, keeping the car straight, flying past the exit to Hollow Creek. The moment they passed it, a shift occurred. Like something unseen had suddenly become aware of what he was doing. The temperature inside the car plummeted. A thick, suffocating cold filled the air, seeping into his bones. The windshield fogged over in an instant, his breath visible in the icy interior. The radio crackled violently, static screaming through the speakers, distorting into an unnatural, garbled whisper. "Turn back." Mark flinched. The voice wasn't his. It wasn't hers. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The girl in the passenger seat stiffened, her hands curling slightly into fists. Her breath hitched, a barely audible gasp slipping from her lips. The pressure around them thickened, the air growing heavier, like the weight of unseen hands pressing against the car, dragging it down. The headlights dimmed, flickering like a dying candle. Mark clenched his jaw and pressed the gas harder. The road ahead stretched endlessly, impossibly long. His stomach twisted. Was he even making progress? It felt like he was driving in place, like Hollow Creek was trying to keep them from leaving. Then, a whisper. "You can't save me." Mark turned his head slightly. She was fading. Her form grew translucent, a shifting mist of half-existence. Her fingers trembled, reaching for something unseen. "No," he said firmly, heart pounding. "You don't have to go back." The car shook violently, as if something had grabbed it from behind, yanking it backward. The tires screeched against the asphalt. The headlights flickered once, twice, then cut out completely. Darkness. Total. Absolute. Mark's breath came in short gasps. He couldn't see. The road was gone. The world outside the car had vanished. There was nothing but an endless, swallowing blackness stretching in all directions. And in that darkness something moved. A shape. A shadow. It loomed just beyond the windshield, shifting, stretching unnaturally tall. Its form was amorphous, twisting in ways that hurt to look at. Its fingers, long, impossibly thin, dragged across the hood of the car, leaving behind deep, jagged scratches. Mark's pulse pounded in his ears. The radio crackled again, a broken, guttural voice rising through the static. "She belongs here." The girl shuddered. Her form flickered, fighting against whatever force was pulling her back. Her lips parted, and for the first time, her voice was more than a whisper. "Drive," she pleaded. Mark didn't hesitate. He slammed his foot against the gas pedal. The engine screamed. The tires skidded. The car lurched forward, tearing through the darkness. The shadow behind them howled. A sound that wasn't human, that wasn't meant for human ears. The headlights burst back to life. Suddenly there was road again. Trees. Sky. The world had returned. The highway stretched before them, leading into the next town. The unnatural cold faded, replaced by the soft, humid air of an ordinary summer night. Mark swallowed hard, glancing to his right. The passenger seat was empty. No water, no scent, no trace that anyone had ever been there. But then, something caught his eye in the side mirror. His breath hitched. The handprint, still on the window, but this time it was on the outside. His fingers tightened around the wheel. The road stretched ahead. Nothing but distant headlights and the occasional flicker of neon from gas stations in the distance. Then, barely audible over the hum of the engine, a whisper so soft it could have been the wind. "I'll always find my way back." Mark didn't stop driving until he reached the next state line. And even then, he didn't look in the mirror again. Ethan Carter had heard the rumors before booking his stay at the Blackwood Inn. Whispers of a cursed room, guests waking up screaming, shadows moving where they shouldn't. But he had never been one to believe in ghost stories. Superstitions were just that, stories people told to scare themselves. Still, as he pulled his suitcase through the grand entrance of the old hotel, an uneasy feeling settled in his chest. The Blackwood Inn stood on the outskirts of town, its once elegant Victorian architecture now weathered by time. The ornate chandeliers still glowed dimly, their golden light unable to chase away the heavy shadows lurking in the corners. The air smelled of aged wood, polished floors, and something faintly floral, lavender, perhaps, though it carried a musty undertone. The receptionist, an older woman with graying hair pulled into a tight bun, barely looked up as he approached the front desk. Her wrinkled hands moved slowly over the guest book, and when she finally met his gaze, something flickered behind her tired eyes. "Checking in?" she asked in a low voice. "Yes, Carter. Ethan Carter. I have a reservation for 2 nights." The woman's eyes darted to the register, then back to him. She hesitated for a moment before reaching for a brass key hanging from a row of hooks behind her. Ethan noted that most of the keys were gone, likely indicating a full house, but the one she took down was near the end, room 306. A frown creased her face. "Are you sure you want this room?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Why wouldn't I?" She exhaled through her nose, shaking her head slightly. "No reason. Just, if you hear anything strange, try not to pay it any mind." A cold knot tightened in Ethan's stomach. "Strange like what?" The woman pursed her lips. "The walls here are old. They creak at night." Something in the way she said it, too rehearsed, too dismissive, made his skin prickle. But he forced a chuckle and took the key. "I'll keep that in mind." The elevator creaked as it carried him up to the 3rd floor, the dim yellow lights flickering slightly. The doors groaned open, revealing a long hallway lined with dark wooden doors. A thick runner rug muffled his footsteps as he walked toward the end of the corridor, where room 306 waited. He hesitated before inserting the key. The brass numbers on the plaque were slightly tarnished, as though too many fingers had brushed against them. A shiver ran down his spine, but he shook it off and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was unremarkable. A queen-sized bed with crisp white sheets, a wooden desk with an old-fashioned lamp, a small TV perched on a dresser. Across from the bed, an ornate mirror in an antique frame hung on the wall. But something about the air felt wrong. It was too still, too quiet. Even the hum of the hotel's heating system seemed absent. He set his suitcase down and walked to the window, pulling back the curtains. Outside, the town's dim streetlights flickered through the mist, but beyond that, there was only darkness. Brushing off his unease, Ethan changed into his nightclothes and climbed into bed. The mattress was firm but comfortable, the blankets warm. He exhaled deeply, willing himself to relax. It was just another hotel. Nothing was going to happen. He drifted off to sleep. A sudden chill jerked him awake. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the curtains. The air was thick and unnaturally heavy, pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. His breath fogged slightly in the air, as if the temperature had plummeted in an instant. A sharp contrast to the warmth he remembered before falling asleep. Something wasn't right. The silence wasn't normal. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a hotel at night. It was something else entirely. A void. The kind of silence that wasn't just the absence of sound but the suppression of it, like the entire world had stopped breathing. Even the faint hum of the air conditioner had vanished. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed the mirror. At first, it was subtle, just a trick of the dim light. The reflection seemed off, like the room wasn't quite the same as the one he was in. His stomach tightened. He squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The bed was there, the desk, the lamp, but something else was, too. A woman. She stood in the mirror, barely visible in the murky glow. Long, damp strands of hair clung to her face, her features half hidden in the shadows. Her skin was pale, deathly pale, as if all the life had been drained from her body. But it was her eyes that made Ethan's blood run cold. Dark, sunken, hollow, and locked onto him. Ethan tried to move, to sit up, to scream, to do anything, but his body refused to obey. His chest rose and fell in ragged, shallow gasps. His limbs frozen as if he had been buried beneath an unseen weight. His heart pounded against his ribs, every beat a drum of sheer terror. The woman in the mirror took a slow, shuddering breath. Her lips parted. No sound came, just a silence so deep it rang in his ears. Then a whisper, "Get out." The sound slithered through the air, a breathless, rasping murmur that sent a jagged chill down his spine. His paralysis shattered. Ethan gasped awake again, this time bolting upright. His heart pounded in his chest, a hammering rhythm that echoed in his ears. Sweat clung to his skin, his shirt damp from sheer panic. His breathing was shallow, uneven, like he had run miles without stopping. The room was silent. The mirror was normal. No woman, no dark, sunken eyes, no whispering voice. But then his breath caught. His stomach lurched. There, on the cold glass, was a single handprint. On the inside, his mind raced. His pulse thundered. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to run. But he didn't. He couldn't. His rational mind clawed for answers. Had he been dreaming? Sleep paralysis? No, this was real. Too real. Slowly, hesitantly, he swung his legs over the bed, his bare feet meeting the icy floor. The chill seeped into his skin, crawling up his spine like a phantom touch. His reflection stared back at him, his own face pale and drawn, his eyes wide with fear. But the handprint, it was distinct, small, almost delicate, yet smeared, as if someone had pressed their fingers against the surface in desperation before slipping away. Ethan's breath came in shallow, uneven gulps. His pulse roared in his ears. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. His fingers hovered just above the mark. The air was colder here, a bone-deep chill that made his skin prickle with unease. The temperature wasn't just lower, it felt unnatural, the kind of cold that didn't come from a draft or an open window. Then, as he watched, the handprint began to fade. Not like condensation drying up, but as if something or someone was wiping it away. From the other side, Ethan stumbled back, his breath hitching in his throat. His stomach twisted into knots. His mouth was dry, his tongue heavy like sandpaper. This wasn't his mind playing tricks. This wasn't some illusion. This was real. He turned sharply, his eyes scanning the room, his senses on high alert. The air felt heavier now, suffocating, thick with something unseen. Every shadow seemed deeper, darker. The dim glow of the streetlights outside barely cut through the oppressive blackness pressing against the windows. His suitcase sat untouched by the door. The window was still closed. A gust of wind rattled the walls. Except, the windows were shut. There was no draft. His pulse quickened. Something was here, watching, waiting. He swallowed hard, forcing a nervous laugh. It's just my mind playing tricks. The lamp flickered. Then the whisper returned. Only this time it was right behind him. Get out. The voice was closer. Too close. So close he could feel the ice-cold breath on the back of his neck. A rush of freezing air swept through the room, and the lights died, plunging everything into complete darkness. Ethan didn't hesitate this time. He lunged for his suitcase, yanking it off the floor, his fingers fumbling with the lock. His breath came in rapid, uneven gasps. The whispering turned into a low, distorted hum, growing louder. Something moved in the darkness. A shadow, flickering, shifting, crawling along the walls, stretching toward him. The door. He needed to get to the door. His trembling hands grasped the key. He twisted the knob. It wouldn't budge. It was locked. From the inside, his breath came in sharp, panicked bursts. He banged on the door, his voice raw and desperate. "Help! Let me out!" No answer. No footsteps. Just silence. Then the whisper returned, right against his ear. "You should have listened." His blood ran cold. Something moved behind him. Presence. A shape in the dark. He could feel it, tall, looming, hungry. Ice-cold fingers wrapped around his throat. The touch sent a violent shudder through his body. The grip tightened. Cold. Unforgiving. Stronger than anything human. Ethan tried to scream, but no sound came. His vision blurred. His lungs burned. The shadows swallowed him whole. The next morning, room 306 was empty. The bed was made. The suitcase was gone. And in the mirror, a single handprint remained, pressed against the glass, waiting for the next guest. A week later, the receptionist checked in another guest. Another skeptic. Another name in the register. The key to room 306 was handed over. The cycle began again. The forest was eerily silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the heavy, unnatural quiet that made every breath sound too loud. The kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Jake adjusted the straps of his backpack and glanced over his shoulder. The sun was setting behind the trees, bleeding orange and purple into the sky. He had been hiking for most of the day, and his legs ached with exhaustion. But there was something else gnawing at him, a feeling, like he was being watched. He shook it off and focused on setting up camp. The clearing he had chosen was perfect, just enough space for his tent, surrounded by towering pines that swayed gently in the evening breeze. He had always loved the solitude of camping alone, away from the noise of the city. No distractions, just him and the wilderness. But as he unrolled his sleeping bag, that feeling returned. Stronger. Jake slowly turned, scanning the tree line. The woods were dense, shadows stretching long and jagged across the forest floor. The wind rustled through the leaves, but there was no movement beyond that. Still, he couldn't shake the unease creeping into his chest. He forced a chuckle. "Relax, man. It's just your imagination." But even as he said it, the feeling lingered. The fire crackled, sending flickering light across the clearing. Jake sat cross-legged near the flames, his knife resting beside him. He wasn't scared, just cautious. He sipped from his water bottle and let his mind drift. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet he should have found calming. But instead, it set his nerves on edge. Then he heard it. A snap. A branch breaking somewhere in the trees. Jake froze, his grip tightening around the handle of his knife. He held his breath, ears straining against the silence. Nothing. Probably just an animal. He exhaled slowly and forced himself to relax. But just as he reached for another drink, his eyes caught something. A shape, just beyond the firelight. A shadow, standing between the trees. Watching him, Jake's pulse slammed against his ribs. The figure was tall, unmoving, blending into the darkness. It didn't shift, didn't flinch, just stood there. His mouth went dry. "Hello." His voice sounded weak, uncertain. No response. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, but the figure remained. Then it moved, not like a person walking, but like a distortion, a ripple in the dark. One moment it was there. The next it wasn't. Jake's stomach twisted. What the hell was that? He grabbed his flashlight and shone it into the trees. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating rough bark and tangled undergrowth. But there was no sign of anything or anyone. After a long moment, he lowered the light. It was probably just exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. The shadows could be deceiving, especially when he was alone out here. That had to be it. With a deep breath, he crawled into his tent, zipping it up tight. But sleep didn't come easily, because even though the fire outside crackled and the wind rustled through the trees, he could still feel it, that presence, watching, Waiting. Jake woke to the soft glow of morning filtering through his tent. The air was cool and damp, carrying the earthy scent of pine and soil. His body ached from the stiffness of sleeping on the hard ground, and his muscles protested as he stretched his arms above his head. He let out a slow breath and rubbed his face. His sleep had been restless, plagued by strange dreams, shifting shadows, whispered voices, the unsettling feeling of being watched. He couldn't remember much, but the lingering unease sat heavy in his chest. Pushing aside the lingering grogginess, he unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The forest was bathed in the golden hues of early morning, the treetops swaying gently in the breeze. Sunlight filtered through the branches, casting dappled patterns onto the ground. The sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves filled the air, the rhythmic pulse of the wild. For a moment he almost laughed at himself. The fear from last night seemed ridiculous now. He had let the darkness and exhaustion get to his head. Shadows played tricks, nothing more. His mind had conjured up shapes that weren't there, fueled by the eerie silence of the wilderness. Still, that feeling. Even now, with daylight illuminating every inch of the forest, a small, nagging sense of discomfort remained at the back of his mind. Like something unseen had followed him into the morning. Shaking off the thought, he moved to prepare for the day. He boiled some water for instant coffee, the familiar bitterness helping to ground him. His hands were steady now, his breathing even. He told himself he just needed to keep busy, to distract himself from the nonsense running circles in his mind. After finishing his makeshift breakfast, he packed up a small bag with essentials. A knife, a map, a flashlight, and some snacks. He figured a short hike would do him good, help clear his head. The trail wound through towering pines and thick undergrowth, the scent of damp moss and fresh earth filling his lungs. With each step, he let the tension ease from his shoulders. The deeper he went into the woods, the more he began to enjoy the solitude again. He followed the trail for about an hour, admiring the untouched beauty of nature. Everything was so still, so perfect. The way the sunlight broke through the canopy, the distant hum of insects. It was exactly why he loved being out here. Then, somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. Jake stopped. His heartbeat thudded against his ribs as he turned, scanning the dense forest behind him. Silence. Nothing moved. Probably just an animal, he told himself. A deer, maybe. Still, the feeling returned. That same feeling. The same one he had last night. The sensation of eyes on his back. His throat tightened. He swallowed hard and forced his feet to keep moving. By the time he returned to his campsite, the sun was already dipping behind the trees, the golden light fading into deep orange and purple hues. The air had cooled significantly, the first hints of evening settling in. Jake exhaled, relieved to be back. The familiar sight of his tent and fire pit made him feel grounded again. Safe. But then, something was wrong. His tent was open, not just slightly unzipped, but wide open. The entrance flapped gently in the evening breeze, the fabric swaying as if something, or someone, had been inside. Jake's stomach dropped. Had he forgotten to close it? No. He was sure he had zipped it shut before leaving. A sharp chill ran down his spine. His eyes scanned the clearing, every muscle in his body tensed. The forest around him remained still. The wind whispered through the leaves, but there was no sign of movement, no sign of anyone. Taking slow, deliberate steps, he approached the tent. His fingers tightened around the knife on his belt. He hesitated for a moment before crouching down and peering inside. Everything was exactly as he had left it. His sleeping bag was still neatly rolled. His backpack leaned against the side of the tent, untouched. His supplies were in place. Nothing had been taken, nothing had been disturbed. But something still felt off. The air inside the tent felt wrong, charged. Almost like an unseen presence still lingered. Like the space had been occupied by something that had just left. Jake swallowed hard and slowly backed out of the tent, standing upright. He scanned the ground for footprints, searching for any sign that someone had been there. Nothing. No footprints. No broken twigs. No disturbed dirt. It didn't make sense. His breathing grew shallow as the unease tightened in his chest. If no one had been here, why did it feel like they had? He spun around suddenly, scanning the tree line. The forest had darkened with the fading light, the shadows stretching long and jagged across the ground. The trees stood tall and unmoving, their silhouettes stark against the deepening sky. And yet, for a split second, he thought he saw movement. A shape tall, thin, standing just beyond the trees. His breath hitched. He blinked, and it was gone. Just the trees. Just the shadows. A shiver crawled down his spine. Had he imagined it? He let out a shaky breath and rubbed his face. No, it was nothing. Just the dimming light playing tricks on his eyes. He was letting his nerves get the better of him again. With an unsteady exhale, he walked over to his tent and zipped it shut tight this time, double-checking that it was secure. Then, trying to shake off the feeling, he gathered some firewood and set up his campfire. The flames flickered to life, casting a warm glow across the clearing. But even as he sat by the fire, staring into the crackling embers, he couldn't ignore the sensation crawling up his spine. The woods felt different now, darker, closer. The wind had died down, and the sounds of the forest seemed more distant. The usual rustling of leaves and chirping of crickets had faded, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy. Too heavy. Jake clenched his jaw and stared into the trees. He wouldn't let this get to him. It was just paranoia, just the tricks of an overactive imagination. But deep down, in the part of his brain that he tried to ignore, he knew something wasn't right. Something was out there, and it was watching him. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the night sky. Jake sat with his knife in hand, his flashlight resting beside him. The feeling was back, stronger than before, the kind of feeling that made his muscles tense and his heartbeat quicken. Then it happened again. A sound, a whisper of movement in the trees. His grip tightened around the knife. Not an animal, not the wind, something else. He turned his flashlight toward the woods. The beam cut through the dark. For a second, there was nothing but trees and shadows. Then there, a figure, closer than before, tall, motionless, watching. Jake's breath hitched. He stood slowly, muscles tensed. His instincts screamed at him to run. But he didn't. Instead, he called out, his voice low but firm. "Who's there?" Silence. Then movement. It was coming closer. Jake's heart pounded. He grabbed his flashlight, shining it directly at the figure. And for the first time, he saw it. A tall, gaunt figure, its limbs impossibly thin. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but its eyes, black, empty, endless. A sharp, suffocating cold filled the air. Then it spoke. "Leave." The words slithered through the dark. A voice that sounded hollow, distant, ancient. Jake stumbled back, his flashlight shaking. His mind screamed at him to move, but his body refused to obey. Then the fire went out. The darkness swallowed him whole. Jake ran. Branches tore at his arms. Roots threatened to trip him, but he didn't stop. He didn't dare look back. The whispering was everywhere now, surrounding him, closing in. "Leave." He reached the trail, his breath ragged, his legs burning. The trees loomed over him, twisting shadows in the moonlight. Then he saw it, standing at the edge of the woods, closer than ever. It tilted its head, those empty black eyes locking onto his. And then it smiled. Jake didn't wait to see what would happen next. He bolted, didn't stop, didn't look back. He reached his car, fumbling with the keys. His hands trembled, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The engine roared to life. He peeled out of there, gravel kicking up behind him. The last thing he saw in his rearview mirror, the figure, standing at the tree line, watching, waiting. And as he sped down the road, one final whisper followed him. "See you soon." Emily Foster was alone in her apartment when the phone rang. It was late, too late for anyone to be calling. She frowned, glancing at the clock. 11:47 p.m. Her phone vibrated against the coffee table, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. She hesitated. Could be a scam call, a wrong number, or something equally unimportant. But something about it felt off. The number looked familiar, almost like she swallowed hard, her heart picking up pace. It looked like his number. No, that was impossible. She had deleted it months ago, because her brother was dead. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the phone. The ringing seemed louder now, insistent, urgent. Finally, she answered. Hello. For a moment there was only static, a faint crackling noise. Then, a voice, soft, distorted, but unmistakable. Emily? Her stomach dropped. She knew that voice. She knew it better than her own. Matt. Silence. Her breath hitched. Couldn't be him. Matt had died 6 months ago in a car accident. She had identified his body herself. The funeral, the grief, the unbearable emptiness of losing her only brother. She had lived through it all. But now his voice was here, on the other end of the line. Emily, listen to me. Matt's voice came again, shaky and urgent. You have to leave. Now. Her skin prickled. What? She started. But the static flared, drowning out her words. His voice came through again, broken and desperate. Emily, he's coming. Don't let him in. The call cut off. Silence. The line went dead. Emily stared at her phone, her pulse hammering in her ears. What the hell had just happened? She tried to call the number back. Disconnected. A cold shiver ran down her spine. Had she imagined it? Had the grief finally cracked something inside her? Her thoughts were racing, trying to make sense of what she had just heard. Then, a knock at the door. A single, deliberate knock. Emily froze. The air in her apartment suddenly felt too thick, too heavy. Slowly, she turned toward the door. Her phone slipped from her fingers, landing on the floor with a dull thud. Because beyond the door, in the dimly lit hallway, she could see a shadow, a tall, unmoving figure, waiting. Emily's breathing came in shallow bursts, her chest rising and falling in rapid succession. She forced herself to think logically. Maybe it was a mistake, a hallucination. Maybe she was hearing things, a trick of exhaustion, grief, stress. But the shadow outside her door was real, and it hadn't moved. A heavy, suffocating stillness filled the room, pressing down on her shoulders like an invisible weight. She took a shaky step backward. Her instincts screamed at her to run. But where? She was on the 3rd floor. No fire escape, no back door. The only way out was through the very door where he stood. Her mind replayed Matt's words, each syllable cutting through her panic like a jagged blade. Don't let him in. Emily swallowed hard. She inched toward the peephole. Slow, careful. Every movement is deliberate. She was terrified, but she had to see. The wood felt ice-cold against her skin as she pressed her forehead against the door. With a trembling breath, she looked through the tiny glass lens. And there he was, a man, tall, dressed in dark clothing, standing completely still. The hallway light flickered, bathing him in sporadic flashes of dim, yellowish glow. Her fingers dug into the doorframe. His posture was unnatural, too rigid, too deliberate, like he wasn't just standing there, but waiting. Emily's stomach churned. His face was hidden beneath the shadows. She couldn't make out his features, but something told her she didn't want to. He wasn't shifting his weight. He wasn't swaying, breathing, adjusting his stance. Nothing. Like he wasn't human at all. A cold, creeping sensation ran up her spine. Emily took a step back, her fingers hovering over her phone on the floor, her mind racing. She had to call someone. The police, a neighbor, anyone. Then, another knock. Harder, more forceful. Boom, boom, boom. The sound exploded through the apartment, vibrating the walls. Emily gasped, stumbling backward. Her legs felt like lead, heavy and useless beneath her. She clutched her chest, trying to steady her breath. But she couldn't. Her heart pounded wildly, erratic and frantic, her body teetering on the edge of panic. She wanted to scream, wanted to run, but all she could do was stare at the door. Boom, 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 louder this time, like a battering ram against the wood. Something in her gut twisted violently, sending nausea rolling through her stomach. This wasn't just some stranger. This wasn't a confused neighbor knocking on the wrong door. This was something else. Presence. Something that shouldn't be here. Emily pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, biting down on her lip to keep from sobbing. The knocking stopped. A beat of silence. Then, a voice. Low, raspy. Not Matt's. Emily. She sucked in a sharp breath, her blood turning to ice. He knew her nom. The voice was wrong. Distorted. Like a recording played at the wrong speed, slow, dragging, inhuman. Like something trying to sound human. Tears burned her eyes. She clapped a hand over her mouth, willing herself to stay silent. Maybe if she didn't move, didn't breathe, he would leave. Maybe he would think she wasn't home. Let me in. Her stomach twisted. No, 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 no. It was a command. Not a question. A demand. The doorknob rattled violently, twisting, jerking, wrenching back and forth with unnatural force. The lock was held. For now. Emily stumbled back, gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had to get out. Now. She scrambled to unlock her phone, but her fingers were slick with sweat, shaking too badly to type 911. Dial 911. But before she could press the call button, the knocking stopped. Silence. Her ears rang from the absence of sound. Her heart pounded in her throat. Was he gone? She strained to hear. Nothing. Then, a whisper. So close. Too close. It was coming from inside the apartment. Don't turn around. She spun anyway, and nothing was there. But the moment she did, the knocking resumed. Louder. More violent. More desperate. Her body moved before her brain caught up. She bolted for her bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it. She grabbed her phone and, with trembling hands, finally managed to dial 911. A woman's voice answered, calm and collected. 911. What's your emergency? Emily sucked in a shaky breath. Someone is trying to break into my apartment. The operator asked for her address. Emily whispered it as quietly as she could. Stay on the line with me, the operator said. Officers are on their way. Another knock. But this time it came from inside the apartment. Emily's breath caught. Her eyes darted to the closet. The bathroom. The dark corners of her room. No, that wasn't possible. The voice from the other side of the door spoke again. Emily, open the door. Matt's voice. But it wasn't him. Tears spilled down her cheeks. No, no, no. Please hurry, she whispered into the phone. The knocking grew more intense, more frantic. Then it stopped. A beat of silence. And then, the sound of footsteps, moving away. Emily held her breath, straining to hear. The apartment grew eerily silent. Minutes passed. Then the sound of sirens. Red and blue lights flashed through her window. She barely heard the officers knocking at the door. Somehow, she managed to unlock it, throwing herself into the hallway as soon as they entered. They searched the apartment. No sign of forced entry. No footprints. No one there. The call records on her phone? No trace of Matt's number. It was as if none of it had ever happened. The officers stayed with her for a while, their calm voices attempting to soothe her frayed nerves. Ma'am, I promise your door was locked when we arrived. One of them said, his voice steady, professional. Emily nodded absently, barely hearing him. Safe. They kept saying she was safe. That it was probably stress, exhaustion, grief playing tricks on her mind. Maybe they were right. Maybe she had imagined the voice. The whispers. Maybe she had imagined the way the air in her apartment had felt charged, thick, suffocating. But deep down, she knew the truth. Something had been here, and something was still watching. As the officers prepared to leave, one of them lingered by the doorway. Ma'am, he said, his brow furrowed. Are you absolutely sure you didn't let anyone in? Emily's stomach turned. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Why would he ask that? Something in his tone made her skin crawl. Why? She managed to whisper. The officer hesitated, then took a small step aside. And that's when she saw it. Her breath hitched. carved into the wood of her front door. Deep, jagged letters that hadn't been there before. A message. See you soon. The room seemed to tilt. The floor felt unsteady beneath her feet. Her throat closed up, her pulse hammering in her ears. She could still feel it. That presence. That wrongness. Like something was still there, lurking just out of sight, waiting. The officer said something else, but Emily didn't hear him. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her vision tunneled, narrowing in on the words, the sharp, uneven cuts in the wood. Someone had done this. Something had done this. Somewhere, in the distance, a phone rang. Shrill, piercing. Emily flinched. Her phone was still on the table, screen dark. The ringing wasn't coming from her apartment. It was coming from somewhere else. It rang, and rang. The officers didn't seem to notice. She swallowed hard, her fingers curling into fists. The phone kept ringing. Her mind screamed at her to answer. But this time, she didn't. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth, rotting leaves, and something metallic. Something Jason couldn't quite place. The towering silhouette of Black Hollow Asylum loomed against the moonlit sky, its jagged roof cutting into the darkness like a row of broken teeth. The structure had been abandoned for decades, yet it stood defiant against time, its presence heavy, almost suffocating. The asylum's windows were shattered, their broken edges catching the faint glow of the moon like shards of glass in an open wound. Vines twisted up the crumbling brickwork, clawing at the structure as if trying to drag it back into the earth. The building itself seemed to breathe, the cool night air whistling through its hollow corridors, creating an eerie, whispering sound that sent shivers down Jason's spine. The heavy iron gates groaned as Jason pushed them open, their rusted hinges shrieking like something alive. A chill ran down his back. He told himself it was just the cold, but deep down he knew better. Something was watching them. "This place is cursed," Jason muttered, tightening his grip on the camera. His voice sounded small against the vast emptiness that surrounded them. Emily rolled her eyes, adjusting the strap of her backpack. "Every haunted place is cursed. That's why we're here." Max, their sound technician, let out a nervous chuckle, though it lacked any real humor. His fingers fidgeted with the EVP recorder in his hands, knuckles white. "Yeah. But most haunted places don't have a documented history of 37 patient deaths, a missing doctor, and an entire wing that burned down mysteriously." Jason exhaled, his breath visible in the cold night air. "Look, we've been to a lot of places. This is no different. We go in, we set up, and we record. If we get something, great. If not, we move on." Silence. The others didn't answer, because they felt it too. This place wasn't just haunted. It was alive. Jason glanced at the main entrance, its massive double doors still intact despite years of neglect. Faded words were etched into the wood above them. Below the inscription, something else had been scratched into the wood. Something newer, something desperate. "Don't listen to them." A gust of wind rushed past, rustling the dead leaves at their feet. Jason felt a pressure in his chest, an invisible weight settling over him. His instincts screamed at him to turn back. Instead, he adjusted his camera strap and took the first step forward. The asylum stood silent, waiting. The massive wooden doors groaned as Jason pushed them open, their rusted hinges screeching in protest. A gust of stale air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of decay, dust, and something foul, something that didn't belong to the living. The beam of their flashlights cut through the thick darkness, illuminating peeling wallpaper, rusted gurneys, and splintered furniture. The walls were covered in faded medical posters, their edges curled with age, their once bright images of human anatomy now smeared with grime. Yellowed patient files lay scattered across the floor, some half open, filled with scribbled notes in handwriting that had long since faded. Jason stepped forward cautiously, his boots crunching on broken glass and brittle paper. The heavy silence of the asylum pressed down on them like a suffocating blanket. "Jesus," Max muttered, sweeping his flashlight over the room. "It's like they just left." Emily, always the skeptic, let out a short breath. Well, the place was shut down in 1968. If you had a reputation for mistreating patients and a mysterious fire, you'd leave in a hurry too. Max swallowed hard. Still, it's like the air is watching us. Jason ignored him and focused on the admission desk, a once grand structure now covered in dust and deep scratches. He brushed away a thick layer of dirt, revealing an old brass nameplate. Dr. Bernard Holloway, chief psychiatrist. The name seemed familiar, though he couldn't place why. Something rustled in the darkness. Jason stiffened. The sound had come from the long hallway ahead, where the patient rooms were. The others heard it too. Emily met his gaze, her flashlight trembling slightly. That wasn't the wind. Jason's grip tightened around the camera. Let's set up. Max knelt near the admission desk, carefully setting up the EVP recorder, a small digital device used to capture electronic voice phenomena. He adjusted the microphone, his fingers shaky. All right, we're alive. Emily moved further into the room, pulling motion sensors from her backpack. She placed one at the entrance of the main hallway, another near the collapsed staircase, and one just outside what appeared to be the old operating room. Jason turned on the night vision camera, adjusting the angle to capture the hallway in full view. His voice was steady, professional, but beneath it was a tension none of them could ignore. All right, let's get started. This is Black Hollow Asylum, abandoned since 1968. Reports of voices, shadows, and unexplained movements. If anyone is here with us, we mean no harm. Silence, the kind that pressed into your ears. Then, faint shuffle. Jason's head snapped toward the hallway. Did you hear that? Emily nodded slowly, her brows furrowing. Yeah, but we're alone. Max's fingers flew over the thermal camera screen. No heat signatures. Jason exhaled, but his gut told him something wasn't right. The air was heavy now, thick with something invisible, something that felt like it was watching. And then, the EVP recorder crackled. A voice, faint, distant, a single word drawn out in a whisper. Stay. The asylum had spoken. An hour passed. The team moved deeper inside, their nerves growing taut. Max played back the first EVP recording. The static crackled. Then, a whisper, a voice that hadn't been there before. Help me. Max's blood ran cold. He rewound the audio, amplifying the sound. The whisper was clearer now. Please, help me. Emily shuddered. That's a voice. A real voice. Jason, ever the skeptic, crossed his arms. Could be radio interference. Max shook his head. No way. This is direct. Something is here. Emily turned to the darkness stretching beyond their flashlights. Then let's find them. They walked deeper into the asylum. The air grew colder. Their breath fogged. The walls, once sterile white, were now stained with time or something else. Jason stopped at an old restraint room, where violent patients had been strapped to their beds. The leather straps still hung loose. The walls were covered in deep scratches. And then, bang, a door slammed down the hall. Max spun around. That wasn't the wind. They ran toward the noise, hearts pounding. The hallway was empty. Jason checked the camera. Nothing moved. Emily turned, her flashlight flickering. Guys! Her voice trembled. At the end of the hallway, a shadow moved. Not fast, not sudden, slow, deliberate, watching. And then, a sound that made their blood freeze. A scream. It wasn't human. Came from everywhere. Jason's flashlight died. Emily gasped as the air turned ice cold. Max dropped the recorder. The asylum was awake. Run! Jason shouted. Their footsteps pounded against the decayed floor, echoing through the empty halls. The darkness behind them felt alive, creeping closer with every frantic step. The hallway stretched endlessly, twisting, shifting. The flickering emergency lights above them seemed dimmer now, as if being swallowed by something unseen. Doors lined both sides of the corridor, some hanging ajar, others shut tight. They should have led to patient rooms. Instead, they led to nothing. Behind one door, a pitch-black void, as if the room had never existed. Behind another, an identical copy of the same hallway they were running through. Behind a third, a reflection of themselves, but the figures inside didn't move. Emily grabbed Jason's arm, her nails digging into his skin. This isn't right. The layout, it's changing. Jason swallowed, forcing his mind to stay focused. This place was warping reality. Max gasped, struggling to keep up. He fumbled with his camera and EVP recorder, his hands shaking. No signal. No readings. We're trapped. Jason's pulse thundered in his ears. He forced his legs to move faster, his only thought. Get out. Then, they stopped. The hallway ended abruptly, forcing them to a halt. A single door loomed in front of them. Jason's breath caught in his throat. Ward C, the wing that had burned to the ground in 1968. But here it was, intact. The charred remnants of its past were still present. Blackened walls, the lingering scent of smoke and ash, the faint outline of scorch marks on the ceiling. Max's voice was barely a whisper. This place shouldn't exist. Jason lifted a trembling hand and pressed it against the old wooden door. It was warm. His heart pounded. Then footsteps, heavy, slow, coming closer. A deep, dragging sound followed, like something scraping against the floor. Jason turned, his breath coming in sharp gasps. At the end of the hallway, standing in the shadows, was a figure. Not a shadow this time. A man, or what used to be one. His skin was gray, stretched thin over sharp bones. His veins darkened like burned roots beneath the flesh. His hospital gown was scorched, blackened by fire. The fabric melted into his skin in places. But his eyes, they burned. Twin embers, glowing with an unnatural orange light, flickering like a dying flame. Emily stumbled back, clutching Jason's sleeve. Oh my God! Max whimpered. What is that? The figure took a step forward. Then another. And then, a voice. A hollow, crackling whisper. You shouldn't be here. Jason staggered back, gripping Emily and Max. The walls began to tremble. The whispers rose. Hundreds of them, overlapping, surrounding them. A chorus of voices, crying, begging, screaming. Jason's head pounded, his vision blurred. Emily clutched her ears, her knees buckling. Make it stop! Max let out a choked scream, dropping his camera as the whispers swelled into an unbearable cacophony. The figure stepped closer, his feet leaving charred footprints with each step. Jason knew if they stayed, they wouldn't leave alive. His instincts screamed at him. Run. Now. He grabbed Emily and Max. Go! They turned and ran. The whispers followed. Doors slammed shut behind them, one by one, as if something was hurting them toward an unknown fate. The walls bent and twisted, the hallway shrinking, pulsing, as if the asylum itself was coming alive. Something was chasing them, and it wasn't human. The exit was closed. The broken front doors came into view. Jason reached them first, throwing his weight against the wood. Max stumbled. Emily grabbed him, pulling him forward. The voices screamed. Jason forced the doors open. The three of them collapsed outside. And just like that, the voices stopped. The night was silent. Max's chest heaved. He clutched his recorder, his fingers white. Emily wiped her face, realizing she was crying. Jason stood up, turning back to the asylum. It loomed quietly in the moonlight, empty, as if nothing had ever happened. But then, Max's recorder cracked. The last EVP recording played on its own. Static. Then, a voice. Clear. Unmistakable. We'll be waiting. The storm rolled in fast, sweeping across the neighborhood with a fury that rattled windows and sent tree branches scraping against the side of the house. Thick clouds swallowed the moon, casting the streets into an unnatural darkness. The wind howled, making the old house groan as if it, too, felt the storm's weight pressing against its walls. Inside, Lucy sat curled up on the living room couch, her phone resting in one hand, a thick blanket draped over her shoulders. The glow of the TV flickered across her face, casting shadows that danced along the walls. She could hear the rain hammering against the roof, a steady rhythm that filled the silence between the occasional roars of thunder. On the floor, tucked beneath their own blankets, sat the twins, Noah and Ben. Their eyes, round and unblinking, were glued to the television screen, though Lucy wasn't sure they were actually paying attention to the cartoon playing. They sat too still, their small hands gripping the fabric of their blankets, their bodies tense. Lucy checked the time on her phone. Almost 10:30 p.m. The boys' parents had said to put them to bed by 9, but with the storm rolling in, she had decided to let them stay up a little longer. Now, though it was late. "All right, guys," she said, stretching her arms. "It's bedtime. Let's get you tucked in." Neither of them moved. Lucy raised an eyebrow. "Did you hear me?" Noah turned his head slightly, but his gaze didn't meet hers. Instead, his eyes remained locked on something beyond her, down the hallway. Ben sucked in a shaky breath and bit his lip, his small fingers gripping his blanket even tighter. We can't sleep yet," he mumbled. Lucy frowned. "Why not?" Noah's mouth opened, but no words came out at first. He seemed to be thinking, debating whether or not to say what was on his mind. Then, in a whisper so soft Lucy almost didn't hear it, he said, "Because he told us not to." Lucy blinked, confusion flickering across her face. "What? Who told you not to?" Ben slowly lifted a trembling hand and pointed toward the hallway. Her eyes followed the direction of his finger. The hallway stretched out in front of them, long and dark, the only light coming from a small night light plugged into the wall near the boys' bedroom. At the very end of the hallway stood a closet door, slightly ajar. A chill crawled up Lucy's spine. Ben's voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke. "The man in the closet." Thunder rumbled outside. Lucy forced a smile, though her stomach twisted uncomfortably. "Guys, there's no one in your closet," she said, keeping her voice light. "It's just shadows and your imagination playing tricks on you." Ben shook his head slowly. "No, he's there. He watches us." Noah scooted closer to his brother. "He doesn't like it when we talk." The wind picked up outside, making the house shudder. A sudden gust rattled the windows, and Lucy flinched despite herself. She inhaled deeply, trying to shake the unease curling in her chest. They were just kids. Kids had wild imaginations. Still, her eyes flickered back toward the dark hallway. The closet door was open only slightly, but something about the sliver of darkness beyond it made her skin prickle. It wasn't unusual for kids to be afraid of closets, but the way the boys sat stiffly, their wide eyes filled with genuine fear, it unsettled her. Lucy sighed and stood up. "All right," she said, stretching her arms. "Let's check it out. But once we see there's nothing there, you both have to go to bed." "Got it." The twins hesitated. Noah's fingers twitched against the fabric of his blanket. Ben swallowed hard, then nodded. Lucy reached for the flashlight on the coffee table and clicked it on. The bright beam cut through the dimly lit hallway, illuminating the wooden floorboards. The boys followed behind her, their footsteps nearly silent. Each step Lucy took made the floor creak beneath her weight. The sound echoed in the quiet house, making it feel as if something else was moving along with them. They reached the closet. Lucy hesitated, her fingers hovering over the doorknob. The metal felt cool, too cool, as if the air around it had dropped in temperature. She frowned. That was strange. The rest of the house was warm. She glanced down at the twins. Noah's breath was shallow, his hands clenched into small fists. Ben bit his lip so hard it had turned white. Lucy inhaled deeply and tightened her grip on the doorknob. "All right, here we go." She swung the door open. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness inside the closet. Empty. The space was small, lined with shelves holding old board games and shoeboxes. A few jackets hung limply from hooks, their fabric swaying slightly from the motion of the door opening. A pile of folded blankets sat in the corner. Nothing unusual. Lucy turned back to the boys, raising an eyebrow. "See? No one's here." Ben's lower lip quivered. Noah's face remained unreadable. "He's still there," Noah mumbled. Lucy's brow furrowed. She turned back to the closet, shining a flashlight across every inch of it. Nothing but old blankets, jackets, and dust. She exhaled sharply. Listen, I promise you, there's nothing in here. I'll shut the door, and it'll stay shut all night. Okay? The twins didn't reply. Lucy knelt down in front of them, her voice softer. You don't have to be scared. I'm right outside. Nothing's going to happen. Ben hesitated before nodding slowly. Noah, after a long pause, did the same. Lucy ruffled their hair and led them to bed, tucking them under their covers. As she pulled their bedroom door shut behind her, she heard Noah whisper, "He doesn't like you." Lucy's breath caught in her throat. Her hand froze on the doorknob. She waited. Silence. Shaking off the lingering unease, she turned and walked back to the living room. As she settled onto the couch, she cast one last glance down the hallway. The closet door had moved. It wasn't wide open, but it was no longer fully shut. A small gap remained, just enough for something to watch. The hallway light spilled into the closet, illuminating the small, cluttered space. Dust floated lazily in the air, disturbed by the movement of the door. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old board games, forgotten toys, and shoeboxes that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. A few jackets hung limply on the metal rod above, their sleeves swaying slightly from the shift in air. In the corner, a pile of old blankets sat in a heap, untouched, empty. Lucy let out a slow breath and turned back to the twins. "See?" she said, forcing a lightness into her voice. "No one's here." Noah didn't look convinced. His lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes flicking from Lucy to the closet and back again. Ben was trembling, his small hands curled into fists at his sides. Noah was the first to speak. "He's still there," he mumbled. His voice was so quiet, Lucy almost missed it over the distant rumble of thunder outside. "You just can't see him." Lucy shivered. The air inside the closet felt different, heavier, thicker. The smell of dust and fabric softener should have been familiar, comforting even, but instead, it seemed stale, stagnant, wrong. It was as if the space had been untouched for decades. Yet she knew the boy's parents had organized it just a few weeks ago. She swallowed against the unease curling in her stomach. "There's no one there," she reassured, kneeling in front of them. "Listen, I promise you, no one is in the closet. The door will stay shut, and I'll be right outside." "Okay." The twins didn't respond right away. Ben stole a nervous glance at Noah, who finally gave a slow, reluctant nod. Ben followed his brother's lead, though his hands remained clenched. Lucy sighed, ruffling their hair before guiding them to bed. She tucked them in, smoothing the blankets over their small frames, and kissed their foreheads. They still looked uneasy, but they didn't protest further. As she stood and stepped toward the door, her fingers wrapped around the knob to pull it shut, she heard it. A whisper, so soft, so faint, she almost convinced herself she had imagined it. "He doesn't like you." She froze, her breath caught in her throat, her fingers tightening around the doorknob. Noah was staring at her, his expression blank, his eyes too wide in the dim light. The room suddenly felt colder. A gust of wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Lucy forced a small laugh, though her voice felt weak in her own ears. "I'm sure he will get over it." She closed the door gently behind her. But as she walked back down the hall, a gnawing unease clung to her, sinking deep into her bones. Lucy sat back down on the couch, pulling her blanket tightly around her. The warmth did little to stop the creeping sensation along her skin. The storm outside had worsened, rain hammering against the roof like desperate fingers clawing to get in. Wind howled through the trees, their branches scraping against the house with an eerie, rhythmic sound. She unlocked her phone and checked her messages. Nothing. Not from the boy's parents. Not from her friends. A strange, suffocating silence settled over the house. The television was still on, but the volume had lowered, the screen flickering with the last remnants of an old cartoon. It wasn't enough to drown out the unsettling quiet pressing in around her. Then, a soft creak. Her head snapped up, The sound had come from the hallway. Lucy's pulse quickened. It was probably just the house settling. Old houses did that. The wind outside was strong. It was nothing. She swallowed and turned back to her phone, tapping absent-mindedly at the screen. Then came another sound. Not wood creaking. Not the wind. A breath. Slow. Shuddering. Right outside the twins' door. Lucy sat frozen, her entire body locked in place. Her ears strained, her own breath caught in her throat. It had been faint, but she knew what she heard. Someone exhaling, low and heavy. The air in the living room suddenly felt thick, pressing against her chest. Her fingers dug into the fabric of her blanket. She turned her head, eyes locked on the dark hallway. Nothing moved. The night light near the boys' room glowed dimly, barely pushing back the shadows. The closet door, she reassured herself, was closed. Right? Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the house for a brief moment. The shadows on the walls stretched and shifted, bending unnaturally. And for a second, just a second, she thought she saw something. Tall, motionless, standing just beyond the hallway's edge. Lucy's heart pounded against her ribs. She forced herself to her feet, her legs moving before her mind could process the decision. Each step felt heavy, deliberate, as if the air around her was thickening, pushing back against her movements. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the hallway light switch. The bulb flickered. Then, darkness. The light went out. Lucy sucked in a sharp breath. The storm outside raged, lightning illuminating the house in brief flashes. For the second time, she saw something shift in the darkness. Something that hadn't been there before. Something too tall to be the twins. Her hands clenched into fists. "It's nothing," she whispered to herself. "Just shadows. Just the storm." Steeling herself, she took a cautious step forward. The floor was cold beneath her bare feet. She exhaled slowly, forcing her breath to steady. Then, a soft click echoed in the silence. Lucy's stomach dropped. Her gaze snapped to the end of the hall. The closet door. It was open. Not just a crack. Wide open. The jackets inside swayed slightly, as if something had just moved past them. The air in the hallway felt colder than before. Heavy, pressing. The shadows inside the closet stretched unnaturally, curling at the edges like fingers reaching outward. Lucy's breath hitched in her throat. A whisper slithered through the dark. Low. Hoarse. Not a child's voice. Not yet. Lucy stumbled back, her hand slapping against the wall as she gasped. The words had been right beside her, near her ear, but the hallway was empty. She turned sharply, expecting what? A figure? A shadow? Something to confirm the icy dread coiling in her gut? There was nothing. The closet door remained open, its darkness yawning, waiting. Lucy's breathing was shallow, her pulse roaring in her ears. She had to close it. She had to. Forcing her legs to move, she took a hesitant step forward. Then another. The air thickened. Another step. The hallway felt longer now, stretched unnaturally. The door growing farther away instead of closer. She could hear something inside. Something shifting. Something breathing. Lucy reached for the door. Then, just before she could touch it, the door slammed shut on its own. A single whisper crawled through the air. Promise. A warning. Not yet. Lucy stumbled back, her pulse hammering in her ears. No, this wasn't real. She fumbled for her phone, the screen's glow weak against the darkness. Then a message popped up. Unknown number. Did you lock the doors? Her stomach dropped. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. But before she could type a response, another sound came from behind her. The twins' door creaked open, a soft patter of footsteps. She turned. Noah and Ben stood there, wide-eyed, their small hands clutching each other. Lucy's voice wavered. "What are you doing up?" Noah trembled. "He's mad." Ben whimpered. "He's coming." A loud bang. The closet door slammed shut. Lucy grabbed the twins and ran. Her shaking hands fumbled with the front door lock, but it wouldn't budge. The house groaned. No, something inside it groaned. The air turned ice cold. A whisper curled through the room. Not yet. Then, footsteps. Heavy. Slow. Coming from the hallway. Lucy's breath hitched. The twins clung to her, their small bodies trembling. She turned and saw him. A tall, gaunt figure stood just beyond the glow of the streetlight. His face was wrong. Stretched too thin, mouth curling too wide. His fingers twitched at his sides, long and bony, nails blackened. His eyes, there were no eyes, just pits of darkness. A slow, rattling breath left his lips. Then, in a voice that scraped against the walls, he whispered, "You shouldn't have looked." The lights flickered. The walls seemed to pulse, shifting, bending. The room closed in. Lucy gasped as the figure stepped forward. The twins sobbed against her, their small hands clawing at her arms. "Make him go away," Ben whimpered. Noah's voice was barely a whisper. "You can't." The thing in the dark smiled, and everything went black. Lucy's eyes shot open. Morning light streamed through the windows. The house was silent. The twins slept peacefully in their beds. Has it been a dream? She sat up, rubbing her face. Her body ached as if she had run miles. Her phone buzzed. A new message. Unknown number. "See you soon." Lucy's breath hitched. She turned toward the hallway. The closet door was open, and inside, a shadow waited,